I was 35 years old the first time I understood what it felt like to disappear while still breathing. Christmas Eve, 23. My father's dining room. The turkey I'd spent 4 hours cooking sat golden on my grandmother's embroidered tablecloth. My mother was laughing at something my younger brother said. The wine was flowing. The snow was falling outside the window like a Hallmark movie. And then my father, drunk on his 6th glass of wine, looked at me across the table and said it. "Crystal, let's be honest. You're just taking up space here." The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then my mother laughed. A nervous, dismissive little sound that meant, "He's joking, don't be sensitive." My brother stared at his plate. The chandelier above us seemed too bright, the air too thick. I felt my hands go numb. I'd heard versions of this my whole life, the subtle digs, the forgotten achievements, the way conversation stopped when I entered rooms. But this was different. This was out loud. This was in front of everyone. So I stood up, folded my napkin, and walked out into the 20-degree cold without a word. I drove 15 minutes before I pulled over, hands shaking on the steering wheel. That's when my phone started ringing. And ringing. And ringing. 42 missed calls in 1 hour. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I held the one secret that could destroy them all. Have you ever been the invisible one in your own family? My name is Crystal Becker. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Boston, and for most of my life I've been very good at being invisible. Not the kind of invisible that comes from shyness or lack of presence, but the kind that happens when the people who are supposed to see you have been looking right through you for so long that you've learnt to take up less and less space until you're hardly there at all. The drive from Boston to my parents' house in rural New Hampshire takes exactly 4 hours, if you don't stop, which I never do. This year, on Christmas Eve 2023, I made the journey with my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tight, and my grandmother's hand-embroidered tablecloth folded carefully in the passenger seat beside me. The fabric was cream-coloured linen with delicate, evergreen branches stitched along the edges in forest green and gold thread. Grandma Helen had given it to me 3 weeks ago with specific instructions. "Give this to your mother's sweetheart. Tell her I made it for the family Christmas dinner." But I knew the truth. My grandmother had embroidered my initials into the corner so small you'd only see them if you were looking. CMB Crystal Marie Becker. This tablecloth was meant for me, not my mother. Grandma Helen just wanted to see if anyone in my family would notice. They wouldn't. They never did. As the highway stretched ahead of me and the December sun began its early descent toward the horizon, I let myself think, the thought I'd been avoiding for weeks. This was my last attempt. I didn't say it out loud, didn't fully articulate it even to myself, but somewhere deep in my chest, I knew. If this Christmas was like all the others, if I spent another holiday cooking and cleaning and smiling, while my younger brother Bradley was praised for simply showing up, if my mother asked me one more time why I was still single, while ignoring every other aspect of my life, if my father looked past me one more time as though I were a piece of furniture, then I was done. I would leave that house and I would not come back. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like relief. My mind drifted back 3 years to Christmas 2020. I'd driven this same route, brought homemade cookies I'd stayed up until midnight, baking, worn a red dress my mother had once said she liked. I'd been excited, foolishly hopeful. Dinner had been pleasant enough until dessert, when my mother turned to me with that particular smile she reserved for moments when she was about to say something she thought was caring, but was actually a knife. "Still no husband, Crystal? You know you're not getting any younger. Maybe you should lower your standards a bit." The table had gone quiet. My father had cleared his throat. Bradley had suddenly become very interested in his phone. And I'd sat there, the bite of pie turning to ash in my mouth, and nodded, smiled, said something about focusing on my career. Then I'd excused myself, driven back to Boston, through tears I couldn't stop, and sworn I'd never let them make me feel that small again. But here I was. Again? I reached over and touched the manila envelope in my glove compartment, the one labelled Important Documents in my neat handwriting. Inside was a piece of paper that could change everything. That would change everything. But they didn't know that yet. Nobody did, except me, my lawyer, and Grandma Helen. The exit for my hometown appeared on the right. I took a deep breath, flicked on my turn signal, and merged off the highway. The winter sun was setting behind bare trees, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of scene that belonged on a Christmas card. But this year, I wasn't coming to endure. I was coming to end it. At this moment, I was still 40 minutes from my parents' house, driving through the twilight, with nothing but my thoughts and the ghosts of every Christmas that had come before. I was a woman who had spent 3 decades trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the investment. I was a daughter who had achieved everything she was supposed to achieve and still somehow ended up feeling like a failure. And I was tired, so deeply bone-achingly tired of pretending that it didn't hurt. The highway narrowed into a 2-lane country road, and with each passing mile marker, my mind began pulling up memories I'd spent years trying to bury. It was like my brain wanted me to remember, wanted me to see the full picture before I walked back into that house. So I let the memories come. Christmas 2013. I was 25 years old and had just received my first real paycheck from my new job as a junior analyst. I'd been so proud, so eager to show my family that I'd made something of myself. I'd spent weeks shopping for the perfect gifts. For my mother, I found a first edition copy of her favourite novel from a rare bookstore in Cambridge, the kind of gift that required research and thought, and genuine attention to who she was as a person. For my father, I bought a vintage fishing lure he'd mentioned wanting years ago, the kind of detail I'd filed away and remembered because I was always paying attention. For Bradley, who was 22 and just starting his first job after college, I bought a leather briefcase, expensive and professional, the kind of thing that said I believed in him. I'd wrapped each gift carefully, written heartfelt cards driven those 4 hours, with butterflies in my stomach because this time they would see how much I loved them. This time would be different. My mother opened her gift, smiled politely, and said it was lovely. 3 days later, I saw that same book on the dining room table with a sticky note that read, "For Margaret, Happy New Year," in my mother's handwriting. She'd re-gifted it to our neighbour. When I asked her about it, trying to keep my voice steady, she'd looked confused. Oh, honey, I already have that book. I thought Margaret would enjoy it more." She didn't already have that book. I'd checked. But it didn't matter. The truth was simply that a gift from me held so little value that it could be casually passed along to someone else without a second thought. Bradley had opened his presents that same morning. A new laptop from our parents' top-of-the-line expensive, wrapped in silver paper with an elaborate bow. "Because you need it for work, son," my father had said, beaming with pride. "We want to invest in your future." Bradley had barely graduated, had a job that paid half what mine did, but he needed it more. He always needed it more. The memory of that Christmas tightened like a fist around my heart as I drove past a farmhouse with lights twinkling in the windows. I'd gone back to Boston that year and cried in my apartment, then carefully filed those feelings away in a mental box labelled "Don't think about this." But the box was overflowing now, and I couldn't keep the lid closed anymore. 5 years earlier, Christmas, 2008, I was 20 years old, home from college for winter break. I'd been up since 6 a.m, preparing the entire Christmas dinner by myself. Turkey stuffing, ashew, mashed potatoes, green bean, casserole, homemade rolls, 2 kinds of pie. My mother had asked if I could help out with the cooking, which in our family meant I would do all of it, while she supervised and offered critiques. I'd chopped and stirred and basted for 8 hours straight, my feet aching, my hands raw from washing dishes between courses. Bradley had slept until 2 in the afternoon, stumbled downstairs in his pajamas, and asked what time dinner was. When we finally sat down to eat at 6 o'clock, my mother had looked at the table laden with food and smiled. "Doesn't everything look wonderful? And Bradley, thank you so much for helping, sweetheart. It means so much when you pitch in." Bradley had set the table. He'd placed forks and knives and napkins in their proper positions, a task that took perhaps 7 minutes. And for this, he received gratitude, acknowledgement, a warm hand on his shoulder, and a kiss on his cheek. I'd stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing my apron, and watched this exchange in silence. No one had thanked me. No one had even looked at me. I'd told myself it didn't matter. That I'd cooked because I wanted to, because I enjoyed it, because it wasn't about recognition. But that was a lie I told myself to make it hurt less. Further back still to Christmas 2003, I was 15 years old. The report cards had come out the week before Christmas, and I'd brought mine home with pride blazing in my chest. Straight A's, on a roll for the 3rd consecutive semester. I'd worked so hard, studied every night, sacrificed sleep and social activities because I thought achievement would earn me the attention I craved. I'd handed my report card to my mother expecting praise, maybe even celebration. She'd glanced at it, nodded and said, "That's nice, honey. Make sure you keep it up." Then she turned back to the pot roast she was preparing. That same evening, Bradley had brought home his report card. C's and D's across the board except for one C+ in math, one marginally passing grade in a single subject. My parents had erupted in the celebration. "Bradley, this is wonderful. You've been working so hard." My father had suggested we all go out for ice cream to celebrate Bradley's achievement, and we did. We got in the car, drove to the local ice cream parlour, and spent an hour celebrating my brother's C's while my straight A's went unmentioned, unremarked upon, as invisible as I was. I'd ordered a chocolate sundae I didn't want and smiled while my parents told Bradley how proud they were of him for really applying himself. I'd eaten my ice cream and felt it sit like a stone in my stomach. And even then, at 15 years old, I'd understood something fundamental about my place in this family. I was the supporting character in their story. I was the backdrop against which Bradley's mediocrity could shine. My successes didn't count because they were expected, assumed, unremarkable. But Bradley's smallest achievement was a miracle worth celebrating. 20 years. 20 years of this pattern, and I'd never named it, never said it out loud, never allowed myself to fully see it for what it was. But driving through the December dusk with the tablecloth beside me and the document in my glove compartment, I finally let myself see the truth clearly. I had spent 2 decades trying to earn love by being good enough, smart enough, helpful enough, invisible enough. And it had never worked because the problem wasn't me. The problem was that they had decided long ago who mattered and who didn't, and I had simply drawn the short straw. The lights of my hometown appeared on the horizon, small and twinkling against the darkening sky. My parents' house was just 10 minutes away now. 10 minutes until I walked back into that dynamic, that role, that suffocating weight of being unseen. And the favoritism would continue the moment I walked through that door. At this point in my journey, I was no longer the hopeful daughter who had started this drive 4 hours ago. I was a woman who had spent the last 60 minutes remembering every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, and I was walking into my parents' house with my eyes wide open for perhaps the first time in my life. I knew what to expect. I knew the script by heart. And yet, some foolish part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. That hope was the cruelest part of all. I pulled into the driveway at exactly 5:27, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. The house looked like something from a magazine, all white clapboard and black shutters with warm golden light spilling from the windows. Wreaths hung on the doors, and someone had strung lights along the porch railing. It looked like the kind of home where a loving family gathered, where everyone belonged, where Christmas magic actually existed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I gathered the tablecloth from the passenger seat, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and forced my face into a pleasant neutral expression. The mask I'd been wearing for 35 years slipped into place so easily, it was second nature. Then, I walked up the front steps and opened the door. "Hello, I'm here," I called out, stepping into the foyer and setting down my overnight bag. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. My mother appeared in the hallway, phone in hand, thumb still scrolling across the screen. She glanced up briefly, her eyes passing over me like I was a piece of furniture that had always been there. "Oh, you made it," she said, her tone flat, almost distracted. Not, "I'm so glad you're here," or "I've been looking forward to seeing you," or even, "How was the drive?" Just an acknowledgement of my physical presence, barely more than she might have offered the mailman. She looked back down at her phone. "Traffic wasn't too bad, I hope." "It was fine," I said, though my hands were still stiff from gripping the steering wheel for 4 hours and my lower back ached from sitting so long. "I brought the tablecloth Grandma Helen wanted me to give you." My mother made a non-committal sound, still absorbed in whatever was on her screen. I stood there for a moment, holding the carefully folded linen, waiting for her to look at me, really look at me, but she didn't. Finally, I moved past her toward the kitchen, feeling the familiar hollowness settling into my chest. I'd barely set the tablecloth on the counter when I heard the sound of tyres on gravel outside. Car doors slamming. And then the front door burst open with an energy that had been completely absent from my own arrival. "We're here!" Bradley's voice boomed through the house, full of that easy confidence he'd always carried, the confidence of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. What happened next was like watching a movie I'd seen 100 times, but somehow still managed to hurt. My mother's face transformed. The distant, distracted expression vanished, replaced by pure joy. She dropped her phone on the counter and rushed toward the foyer. "Bradley, oh sweetheart, you're here." Her voice was warm, alive, nothing like the monotone she'd used with me moments before. I followed slowly, watching from the kitchen doorway, as my mother threw her arms around my younger brother, holding him like he'd returned from war, rather than a 45-minute drive from Portsmouth. My father emerged from his study, and his face lit up in a way I rarely saw. "There's my boy," he said, his voice thick with pride and affection. Bradley was engulfed in hugs, his girlfriend Sarah smiling beside him, and for a solid 3 minutes, the foyer was filled with exclamations of, "We missed you so much," and "The house feels empty without you," and "It's not Christmas until you're home." I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching this reunion, and felt something crack inside my chest. 10 minutes. He'd arrived 10 minutes after me, and the difference in reception was so stark it might as well have been written in neon lights. I'd gotten, "Oh, you made it," without eye contact. He'd gotten a homecoming parade. Bradley finally noticed me standing there. "Hey sis," he said, giving me a quick one-armed hug that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Good to see you." Then he was immediately pulled back into the orbit of our parents' attention, and I faded into the background again, right where I'd always been. "Bradley, you must be exhausted from the drive," my mother said, her hand on his arm, her voice dripping with concern. "Go sit down in the living room. Relax. Can I get you something to drink? Are you hungry?" "I'm good, Mum," Bradley said, but he was already moving toward the living room, already assuming the position of honoured guest, while I still stood in the kitchen, holding a tablecloth nobody had asked about. My mother turned to me then, and her expression shifted back to that business-like efficiency. "Crystal, would you mind helping with dinner? I'm running a bit behind, and I could use an extra pair of hands in the kitchen." Not a question. A directive. Despite the fact that I'd just driven 4 hours. Despite the fact that Bradley, who'd driven 45 minutes, was being ushered to a comfortable chair and offered refreshments. "Of course," I heard myself say, because this was my role. This was the script, and I didn't know how to say no to these people, even when every fibre of my being wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. I moved into the kitchen and began unpacking groceries. My mother pointed to chopping vegetables. She indicated needed cutting. Stirring pots, she told me to watch. Through the doorway, I could hear Bradley holding court in the living room, my parents' laughter ringing out at something he'd said. After about 20 minutes, my father called out, "Bradley, come tell your old man about that promotion at work." "It's not exactly a promotion, Dad," Bradley said, but I could hear the pleasure in his voice at being asked. "More of a lateral transfer. Different department, same level, but it's a good opportunity." I paused in my vegetable chopping, listening as Bradley described what was essentially a sideways move in his company's organisational structure. He made it sound impressive, certainly using words like strategic initiative and leadership opportunity, but I knew enough about corporate structure to understand he hadn't actually moved up. He'd simply moved over. The response from the living room was thunderous. My mother gasped with delight. My father called out, "That's my boy, I knew you had it in you." I heard the distinct pop of a champagne cork, heard glasses being poured, heard my father proposing a toast to Bradley's success and bright future. They were celebrating a lateral transfer like he'd just been named CEO. 3 months ago, I'd successfully completed a major project at work that had brought in a 7-figure client and earned me a bonus substantial enough to put a down payment on a house. I'd mentioned it in passing during a phone call with my mother. She'd said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately changed the subject to ask if I'd heard that Bradley was thinking about getting a dog. I set down the knife carefully, afraid my shaking hands might cause an accident, and reached for the tablecloth. I needed to do something, anything, to keep my composure. I unfolded the linen and carried it to the dining room table, smoothing it across the polished wood surface. The evergreen embroidery caught the light beautifully, and for a moment I allowed myself to appreciate the work Grandma Helen had put into it, the hours of careful stitching, the love woven into every thread. My mother walked into the dining room, glanced at the table and paused. I waited, hoping for something, anything, that resembled appreciation or recognition of the gift. "The colour's a bit dark, but I suppose it'll do," she said, her tone suggesting I'd brought something barely adequate, rather than an heirloom-quality piece of craftsmanship. Then she turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my hands still resting on the tablecloth. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, then another. I'd been in this house for 30 minutes, and already I felt myself shrinking, disappearing, becoming that invisible support character again. I forced myself to return to the kitchen to continue my assigned tasks, to smile and nod, and play my role. But in the kitchen, as I reached for a pot on the stove, I heard my mother's voice drifting from the hallway, where she was talking to my father in what she thought was a private whisper. The words were clear, casual, thoughtless, and they stopped my heart mid-beat. Thank God Bradley came home. Just Crystal would have been so depressing. I stood frozen at the stove, my hand still reaching for the pot handle. Those words echoing in my head like a slap I hadn't seen coming. Just Crystal would have been so depressing. Not even an acknowledgement of the hurt such words might cause just a casual observation delivered in the same tone she might have used to comment on the weather. I was the depressing option, the disappointing daughter whose presence alone wasn't enough to make Christmas feel like Christmas. I blinked hard, forcing back the burning sensation behind my eyes, and gripped the pot handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't fall apart. Not yet. Not here in this kitchen, where I'd been assigned to work, while Bradley held court in the living room like visiting royalty. I didn't know it then, but while I stood there absorbing my mother's careless cruelty, something was happening in my father's study that would change the trajectory of this entire night. I wouldn't learn about it until much later, but this moment, this exact moment at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, was when the first domino began to tip. My father had excused himself from the living room celebration, claiming he needed to fetch a better bottle of wine from his study to properly toast Bradley's lateral transfer masquerading as success. He'd walked down the hallway, his steps slightly uneven from the 2 glasses he'd already consumed, and entered the wood-panelled room that served as his private sanctuary. The study was exactly as it had always been, lined with bookshelves he never read, decorated with fishing trophies from his youth, smelling of old leather, and the faint mustiness of papers left too long in drawers. He moved toward the antique filing cabinet in the corner, the one with the sticky bottom drawer that always required a forceful tug to open. He pulled, using perhaps more strength than necessary, and the drawer came flying out with such momentum that it tilted, spilling its contents across the Persian rug. File folders, scattered papers fanned out in disorder, and among them a single legal document slid across the floor and came to rest at his feet. He bent to retrieve it, his hand reaching automatically, but when his eyes focused on the words printed across the top of the page, he froze. Property deed, County of Rockingham, State of New Hampshire. And there, in black ink on official government letterhead, 2 names listed as owners: David, Michael Becker and Crystal Marie Becker, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. He sank into his desk chair, still holding the document, and 5 years collapsed into this single moment. He remembered everything. The summer of 2018, the heat that had felt oppressive and suffocating, much like the financial situation that had been closing around his throat like a noose. The bank letters that had progressed from warnings to threats to final notices. The mortgage he'd refinanced twice, already borrowing against a house that had been in his family for 3 generations. The 60 days notice of foreclosure proceedings. The shame that had kept him awake at night, the terror that he would be the Becker who lost the family home, who failed where his father and grandfather had succeeded. He remembered the phone call he'd made to Crystal, his voice breaking as he explained the situation, expecting judgment or disappointment. Instead, her response had been immediate and calm. "I can help, Dad. I have savings, enough to pay off the mortgage, but I need something in exchange." He remembered the shock of that, the fact that his daughter had accumulated that kind of money while he'd been too absorbed in Bradley to even ask about her career. Her terms had been simple and fair. She would pay off the $180,000 owed to the bank, and in return, he would add her name to the property deed as a joint owner. 50-50, equal partners. He'd agreed because he had no choice, because the alternative was losing everything. They'd met with lawyers, signed papers, transferred funds. Crystal had written a check that had saved his legacy, and he'd given her legal ownership of half the house she'd grown up in. Then, he'd come home and lied to his wife. Told Patricia that an old college friend had loaned them the money at a generous interest rate, that they'd work out a payment plan, that everything was fine. Patricia had been so relieved she hadn't questioned it. Bradley had never known there was a crisis at all. And for 5 years, my father had lived with this secret, this debt that couldn't be measured in dollars. He'd watched me come home for holidays, watched Patricia treat me like an afterthought, watched Bradley receive praise for mediocrity while my achievements went unnoticed, and he'd said nothing. He'd kept the truth buried in that file drawer, along with his guilt and his shame and his growing awareness that he'd failed me in ways that went far beyond finances. Now, sitting in his study with that deed in his hands, he understood with terrible clarity that tonight, this night, he would have to tell the truth. He couldn't let me leave tomorrow without them knowing what I'd done. But the thought of that conversation, of seeing Patricia's face, of watching Bradley realize his golden pedestal was built on his sister's money, filled him with a dread so profound he could barely breathe. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out the bottle of whiskey he kept there, the good stuff he saved for moments when wine wasn't strong enough. He poured 3 fingers into a crystal tumbler and drank half of it in one burning swallow. The alcohol hit his system on top of the wine already there, and he felt the world soften slightly around the edges, felt his courage artificially bolstered by liquid courage that wasn't really courage at all. He held the paper in shaking hands, knowing he owed his daughter everything and had given her nothing. I was still in the kitchen when my father returned from his study, though I'd managed to compose myself enough to continue preparing dinner with mechanical efficiency. I'd spent 35 years perfecting the art of swallowing, hurt of functioning while bleeding internally, and tonight was no different. except for the growing certainty that this would be the last time I performed this particular dance. I was a woman, standing at a crossroads, though I didn't fully understand yet that the decision had already been made. My hands moved through familiar motions, chopping and stirring and arranging while my heart grew harder with each passing minute. I was reaching my limit, and some part of me knew that when I finally hit it, there would be no going back. My mother swept into the kitchen with her phone still in hand, glancing at the vegetables I'd been chopping for the last 20 minutes. She picked up a piece of carrot, examined it with the critical eye of a jeweler, inspecting a flawed diamond, and sighed with obvious disappointment. "Why did you cut the vegetables so large, Crystal? They're supposed to be uniform. Didn't I teach you anything?" Her voice carried that particular edge of long-suffering patience, as if my incompetence was a burden she'd been bearing for decades. I looked down at the cutting board at the vegetables I'd cut to exactly the size specified in her own handwritten recipe card that sat propped against the backsplash. 1/4-inch pieces, it said in her looping cursive. I'd measured. I had literally measured with a ruler, because I'd known that nothing I did tonight would be good enough. "I followed your recipe," I said quietly, keeping my voice neutral. 1/4-inch pieces. She waved her hand dismissively, already moving on to the next criticism. "Well, they look too large. You'll need to cut them smaller." She lifted the lid on the pot where the turkey breast was simmering in broth and wrinkled her nose. "And this meat is overcooked. Look how dry it is. Can't you do anything right?" The meat wasn't overcooked. I checked it with a thermometer 10 minutes ago. It was exactly 165 degrees, the safe temperature for the poultry, cooked for the exact time her recipe specified. But facts didn't matter in this kitchen, in this house where my mother's perception was the only reality that counted. I felt something tighten in my chest, a band of pressure that made it hard to breathe normally, but I forced a smile and nodded. "I'll try to do better." I heard myself say the words automatic programmed into me from decades of practice. "I'll try to do better. I'll be better. I'm sorry I'm not good enough," the script I'd been reciting my entire life. I turned my attention to setting the table, carrying the good china, from the cabinet to the dining room where my grandmother's tablecloth waited. I ran my hand over the embroidered evergreen branches, remembering the love that had gone into every stitch, and felt a sharp pang of grief for the recognition I'd hoped to receive. "Mom!" I called back into the kitchen, keeping my voice light. "The tablecloth really is beautiful, isn't it, Grandma? Helen spent months on it." My mother appeared in the doorway, barely glancing at the table. "Grandma Helen's taste was always rather peculiar," she said, her tone suggesting she was being generous by not saying something harsher. "But we'll use it to be polite. It would hurt her feelings if we didn't." Not a word of appreciation for the craftsmanship, not a moment of recognition that this gift had been meant to create connection. Just dismissal, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. I watched my mother's face as she looked at that tablecloth, looked at the hours of work and love stitched into linen, and saw nothing but obligation. My face fell before I could stop it, and for just a moment I felt the mask slip, felt the hurt show through. I was saved from having to respond by Bradley's arrival in the kitchen, drawn by the smells of cooking food, and perhaps by the unconscious knowledge that wherever the family gathered, he would be welcomed. He leaned against the counter with the easy casualness of someone who had never questioned his right to take up space, watching me arrange dishes with an amused expression. "Well, at least you're good at cooking, sis," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the tone that suggested he was being playful, bonding, engaging in the kind of sibling teasing that in healthy families might actually be affectionate. "Shame nobody wants to marry a woman who only knows how to stay in the kitchen." He laughed at his own joke, a genuine laugh that expected me to join in to appreciate his wit. I turned to look at him, and my smile froze on my face like ice forming over still water. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched him continue chuckling, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just reduced my entire existence to a collection of domestic skills, and found even that lacking because it hadn't resulted in a husband. He didn't notice my frozen expression. He didn't see the way my hands had gone still on the serving platter I was holding. He didn't understand that he'd just stabbed me in a wound that had been bleeding for years. He simply helped himself to a piece of cheese from the appetizer tray and walked back into the living room, still chuckling, leaving me standing in the kitchen with my heart pounding and my vision tunneling. I set the platter down very carefully, then gripped the edge of the counter with both hands, my knuckles going white from the pressure. I breathed in deeply through my nose, held it for 4 counts, released it slowly through my mouth. This was a technique my therapist had taught me years ago for managing anxiety, for surviving moments when the world felt like it was crushing you. Just a few more hours, I told myself silently, repeating it like a mantra, like a prayer. Then I can leave. Just hold on. Just survive this dinner. Just get through tonight, and tomorrow you can go home to Boston and never come back. Just hold on. But even as I repeated these words to myself, I could feel something cracking inside me, some structural support that had been bearing weight for too long, finally beginning to give way. And then the dinner bell rang, summoning them to the table. I was carrying the last serving dish into the dining room when everyone began taking their seats, and I watched the familiar choreography unfold, with the detachment of someone who had seen this play performed too many times to find it surprising anymore. I was a woman who had finally stopped expecting different results from the same actions, who had reached that dangerous point of clarity, where you can see the patterns you've been living in for what they truly are. My role in this family had been cast long ago, and tonight I was simply walking through the motions, one final time, though they didn't know it yet. I set the dish down and took my place at the table, the place that had always been mine, the place that said everything about how this family saw me. Bradley sat between my parents like a prince, flanked by attendants, the centre seat, at the table that had always been reserved for him, the position of honour and favour. My mother sat to his right, my father to his left, both angled slightly toward him, as if he were the sun around which they orbited. Sarah, his girlfriend, sat beside him, smiling politely, and clearly trying to navigate the complex dynamics of a family she didn't yet fully understand. And I sat at the end of the table, the furthest seat from the centre of attention, separated from the family cluster by empty space and unspoken hierarchies. It was symbolic, this arrangement, though I doubted anyone else even noticed. They'd been placing me at the margins for so long, it had become invisible to them, as invisible as I was. My mother began serving, and I watched her pile Bradley's plate with generous portions of everything: the turkey breast I'd cooked, the mashed potatoes I'd whipped until my arm ached, the green beans I'd sautéed with almonds, the stuffing I'd made from scratch. She gave him the choice pieces, the tender meat, the crispy skin, never asking if he wanted seconds before loading his plate. When she reached my plate, her movements were perfunctory efficient, giving me standard portions without comment or care, as if she were fulfilling an obligation rather than feeding her daughter. The conversation began almost immediately, and it flowed in the direction it always flowed, like water, finding the path of least resistance. "Bradley, you look so healthy," my mother exclaimed, reaching over to squeeze his arm. "Doesn't he look wonderful, David?" My father nodded, smiling with genuine warmth. "The new job must be treating you well, son." Bradley demurred with practiced modesty, but I could see the pleasure in his face, the easy acceptance of their admiration as his natural due. "Have you thought about buying a house?" my father asked, leaning forward with interest. "Your mother and I have been discussing it, and we'd be happy to help with the down payment. A young man like you should have property build equity. It's an investment in your future." I felt my thought pause halfway to my mouth. They'd be happy to help with a down payment. For the brother who made $60,000 a year and spent money as fast as he earned it. Meanwhile, I'd saved for 7 years to afford my own small condo in Boston, never once asking them for help, because I'd learned long ago that help was not something offered to me. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," my mother added, her voice warm with affection. "You've always made us proud." The words landed like stones in my chest, heavy and hard, because I knew with absolute certainty that she meant them. She was proud of Bradley. His lateral transfer, his adequate performance, his mere existence made them proud. And I, with my graduate degree and my six-figure salary and my completely self-sufficient life, made them nothing. Then the questions turned to me, and I braced myself because I knew what was coming. The questions that looked like interest but were actually indictments. "So, Crystal," my mother said, her tone shifting to something that might have passed for casual if you didn't know better. "Any men in your life? Anyone special?" The subtext was clear. Are you still failing at the most basic expectation we have for you? Are you still disappointing us by being unmarried at 35? "No, Mum, still single," I said, keeping my voice light, trying to deflect with brevity. "Still at that small company?" my father asked, and the word small carried weight, carried judgment, carried the implication that my employer was somehow inadequate, that I had settled for less than I should have. Never mind that my small company was a respected investment firm with 200 employees and clients across the country. It wasn't a name they recognised, so it didn't count. Yes, still there. Actually, I just completed a major project. I began hoping perhaps this time they might ask, might show interest, but my mother cut me off, her attention already sliding away. "Don't you think it's time to settle down, honey? You're not getting any younger, and men don't want women who are too focused on their careers. You need to think about your future." Each word was a small knife slicing away at whatever composure I had left. Not getting any younger. Too focused on careers. Need to think about your future. As if my future only mattered, insofar as it included a man, as if my accomplishments meant nothing without a husband to validate them. I looked down at my plate, not trusting myself to speak, and that's when I noticed my father staring at me. Really staring with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. His eyes were slightly unfocused. His face flushed, and his wine glass was already empty again. I'd lost count of how many times I'd seen him refill it, but it was more than was wise, more than was normal, even for a holiday dinner. He opened his mouth as if to say something, and I felt a strange flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe he would defend me. Maybe he would tell my mother to stop. Maybe this time would be different. But he closed his mouth again, reached for the wine bottle, and poured himself another glass. The 5th glass. I watched the dark red liquid fill the crystal, watched him bring it to his lips and drink deeply, watched him set it down and immediately lift it again. My mother didn't notice, too absorbed in describing to Bradley and Sarah the vacation home she wanted to rent next summer, asking if they'd like to join. No mention of whether I'd be invited. No acknowledgement that I was sitting right there listening to plans being made that didn't include me. My father kept staring at me across the table, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like anguish, like guilt, like he was wrestling with something he couldn't quite bring himself to voice. He lifted his glass again, the 6th glass, and then he opened his mouth and said the words that would shatter everything. I was sitting at the end of the table, fork in hand, trying to make myself smaller, in a space where I already barely existed, when my father's voice cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. I had reached the point where I was simply surviving each moment, counting down the minutes, until I could excuse myself and retreat to the guest room, where I could finally drop the mask I'd been wearing. I was a woman, balancing on the edge of something I didn't yet have a name for, hovering between endurance and collapse, and I didn't know that the next 10 seconds would make the choice for me. My father's eyes were glassy with wine, his face flushed and his words slightly slurred, and when he spoke I could tell he thought he was being funny, thought he was making some kind of self-deprecating joke that would lighten the mood. "Come on, Crystal," he said, gesturing vaguely with his wine glass in a way that made the dark liquid slosh dangerously close to the rim. "You know the truth. Let's just be honest here. You're just taking up space." He laughed, a wet, uncomfortable sound that died in his throat when he saw my face. "You're just taking up space here." The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly, I wasn't sitting at the Christmas dinner table anymore. I was 12 years old, standing in the garage on a Saturday morning in July, watching my father and Bradley load camping gear into the back of our old Suburban. I'd been so excited because we'd been talking about this trip for weeks, planning the hikes we'd take and the fish we'd catch, and I'd already packed my backpack with clothes and my favourite flashlight. But when I'd appeared in the garage with my gear ready to go, my father had looked at me with surprise and confusion. "What are you doing, honey?" he'd asked, and I'd felt the first flutter of anxiety in my stomach. "I'm ready for the camping trip," I'd said, my 12-year-old voice bright with anticipation. My father had exchanged a look with my mother, who had suddenly appeared in the doorway, and then he'd crouched down to my level with that expression adults use when they're about to deliver disappointment packaged as reasonableness. "Sweetie, the tent's only big enough for 3 people. It's going to be me, Bradley, and Grandpa this year. Maybe next time." I'd felt tears burning behind my eyes and blinked them back hard. "But you said we'd all go camping," I'd protested, my voice smaller now. My father had stood up his attention, already moving past me to the remaining gear that needed loading. "You'd just be taking up space, honey. There's not enough room." Taking up space. As if my presence was an inconvenience, an overflow, something that didn't quite fit into the family configuration they'd already decided on. I'd watched them drive away that morning, Bradley waving from the back window, with excitement that had no room for guilt because, at 12 years old, he didn't yet understand that he was being chosen over his sister. And I'd stood in the driveway long after the car had disappeared around the corner, understanding for the first time that my place in this family was negotiable in a way that Bradley's never would be. Now, 23 years later, those same words landed in almost the exact same tone delivered by the same man who had taught me that I was excess unnecessary, the one who could be left behind. The table fell silent, that particular silence that follows when someone says something so inappropriate that no one knows quite how to respond. 3 seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. Seconds where everyone processed what had just been said, where they each made the choice about whether to acknowledge the cruelty or pretend it away. My mother was the first to speak, her laugh nervous and brittle. "Oh, David, your father's joking, dear. He's had too much wine. You know how he gets." She was already rewriting the narrative, already spinning what had just happened into something more palatable, something we could all pretend we hadn't really heard. Bradley stared at his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, and I could see the discomfort in his face. But he said nothing. He never said anything. Sarah looked between us all with wide eyes, clearly understanding that something significant had just occurred, but not yet grasping the full weight of it. And then I heard it. The sharp clatter of metal on china. Grandma Helen's fork hitting her plate, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. I looked at her and saw fury in her elderly eyes, saw her mouth pressed into a thin line, saw her hands trembling slightly as she placed them flat on the table. But she didn't speak either. Not yet. I looked down at my water glass at the condensation beading on the crystal surface, and in the distorted reflection I saw my own face looking back at me. A ghost. That's what I looked like. A ghost at my own family's table, transparent and insubstantial, barely there at all. The sound in the room became muffled, as if someone had wrapped me in cotton, and I felt something inside my chest that had been holding on for 35 years finally let go. It didn't break with a dramatic snap. It simply released like fingers that had been gripping too long, finally going slack. That was the moment. The exact moment when Crystal stopped trying. I was still sitting at the table, that ghost in the water glass, staring back at me, and I realised with startling clarity that I didn't have to do this anymore. I was a woman who had finally reached the end of a very long road, who had arrived at the destination she'd been walking toward for years, without quite knowing it, and the destination was simply this: I could leave. Right now. I could stand up and walk away from this table, this house, These people who had spent 35 years teaching me that I didn't matter and nothing bad would happen to me. In fact, something good might happen. I might finally be able to breathe. The realization settled over me like a blanket, warm and surprisingly gentle, and with it came a calmness I hadn't felt in years. No anger, no tears, just clarity and the quiet certainty that I was done. I set my fork down on my plate. Not thrown, not slammed, but placed with deliberate care, the metal making only the softest clink against the china. I stood up my chair, scraping slightly against the hardwood floor, and the sound seemed enormously loud in the continued silence. Everyone turned to look at me, their faces registering confusion rather than concern. They were waiting for me to say something, to apologize for being sensitive, to laugh it off and sit back down and allow us all to pretend that nothing had happened. That's what I'd always done before. That's what they expected. I said nothing. I walked around the table to where Grandma Helen's tablecloth lay spread across the polished wood, and I began to fold it. My movements were slow and methodical, smoothing out each crease, aligning the corners with precision. The evergreen embroidery passed through my hands, all those hours of patient work, all that love stitched into linen that my mother had dismissed as peculiar. I folded it into a neat rectangle and tucked it under my arm. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, and her tone was one of mild irritation rather than concern, as if I were being dramatic over nothing. "Crystal, sit down. We haven't had dessert yet. I made your favourite pie." She said this as if the pie would fix everything, as if apple pie could somehow erase what had just been said, could fill in the hole where my dignity used to be. I still said nothing. I walked to the coat closet in the foyer, removed my winter coat and put it on with the same careful deliberation I'd used to fold the tablecloth. I zipped it up, wrapped my scarf around my neck, put my gloves on one finger at a time. Behind me, I could hear the scraping of chairs, the murmur of confused voices. "What's she doing?" Bradley's voice. "Should someone stop her?" Sarah's uncertain whisper. "She's just being dramatic." My mother dismissive as always. I picked up my purse and my overnight bag from where I'd left them by the door. I placed the tablecloth carefully on top of my belongings. Then I put my hand on the doorknob and stood there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably only 5 seconds. 5 seconds where I gave them the chance to understand what was happening, to call out, to say they were sorry, to ask me to stay in a way that meant something. 5 seconds where I waited for my father to say he didn't mean it, for my mother to realise she'd gone too far for Bradley to defend me for once in his life. The silence stretched. I could feel them watching my back, could sense their expectation, that I would turn around, that this was all some kind of scene I was creating for attention, that I would apologise and we'd all move on. They were waiting for me to be who I'd always been, the daughter who absorbed hurt and said nothing, who made herself smaller so they could be bigger, who disappeared so completely that they never had to confront their own cruelty. I opened the door and stepped out into the 20-degree cold. The shock of it hit my face like a slap, but it felt cleansing, somehow sharp and real and honest in a way the warm house behind me had never been. Snow was falling in fat, lazy flakes that caught in my hair and on my eyelashes. The world was quiet and white and beautiful, and I was walking into it alone, and I realised I didn't mind that at all. I heard the door close behind me with a solid thunk. I walked to my car, opened the trunk, placed my bag inside, got into the driver's seat and closed the door, sealing myself into the cold interior. I sat there for a moment, my breath making clouds in the frigid air, and waited for the tears to come, for the breakdown, for the emotional collapse that surely should follow walking out on your family on Christmas Eve. The tears didn't come. I didn't scream or sob or pound my fists on the steering wheel. Instead, I felt an eerie calm, a peace so profound it was almost frightening. I started the engine and turned on the heat, waiting for the car to warm up. And as I sat there watching my family's house through the windshield, all lit up and pretty like something from a movie about functional families, I whispered to myself, I'm free. The words felt true. For the first time in my entire life, they felt completely, absolutely true. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the driveway, and began to drive down the quiet suburban street, leaving behind the life I'd been trying to live for 35 years. I drove slowly through the falling snow, not quite sure where I was going, knowing only that it was away from that house, away from those people, away from the girl I'd been who kept hoping they'd love her if she just tried hard enough. I made it about 15 minutes before I pulled into the parking lot of a closed grocery store, needing a moment to process what I'd just done, needing to sit in the quiet and understand that I'd actually left. I put the car in park and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for decades. But 10 minutes later, my phone began to ring. And ring. And ring. I was sitting in my car in that empty parking lot, hands still on the steering wheel, though the engine was off, watching snow accumulate on the windshield, and feeling something that resembled peace for the first time in longer than I could remember. I was a woman who had just made the hardest decision of her life, and was still processing the enormity of it, still adjusting to the strange lightness that came from finally choosing myself over the people who had never chosen me. The phone sat in the cup holder beside me, screen dark and silent, and I was grateful for the quiet. I needed this moment, this space to breathe, to understand that I had actually done it. I had left. I wasn't going back. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known sitting there in that parking lot 15 minutes away from the house I'd grown up in, was that in the moment I'd walked out that door, everything inside had begun to unravel. My father had stood up the instant the door closed behind me. According to what I would piece together later from multiple accounts, he'd pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair had tipped over, and he'd started toward the foyer with the intention of going after me. I have to tell her. He'd said, his words slurring together, his movements unsteady. I have to tell her the truth. Right now. I should have told her years ago. My mother had tried to stop him, her hand on his arm, saying something about letting me cool down first, about handling this tomorrow, when everyone was calmer, but he'd shaken her off with uncharacteristic force. He'd made it 3 steps before the room tilted sideways. The combination of 6 glasses of wine on top of his blood pressure medication, the emotional stress of watching his daughter walk out the guilt he'd been carrying for 5 years about the secret in his filing cabinet, all of it came together in his body like a perfect storm. The dizziness hit him so suddenly, he didn't have time to catch himself. His leg simply stopped working, stopped holding him up, and he fell forward, his temple connecting with the sharp corner of the dining room chair on his way down to the hardwood floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground brought everyone to their feet. Bradley told me later that there was a moment of stunned silence before anyone moved a heartbeat, where they all stood frozen, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Then my mother screamed a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and everyone rushed forward at once. My father wasn't unconscious, not completely, but he was disoriented, confused, his eyes unfocused and his words coming out jumbled. Crystal! He kept saying the name slurred but recognizable. Crystal, I need to tell her. Where's Crystal? His hand reached up toward his head where a red mark was already forming on his temple, and when his fingers came away, there was blood, not much, but enough to make everything feel more serious, more frightening. David, don't move! Oh, God, don't move! My mother was on her knees beside him, her phone already in her hand, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was high and panicked, giving the address, describing what had happened, saying yes, he'd been drinking. Yes, he was on blood pressure medication. Yes, he hit his head. Please hurry. Please send someone right away. Bradley had grabbed a dish towel and was pressing it gently against the wound on my father's temple, his face pale and frightened. Sarah stood back, clearly not knowing what to do, her hand covering her mouth. Grandma Helen remained seated at the table, but her face had gone grey, and her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her papery skin. The paramedics arrived at 8:15, their lights flashing red and blue through the windows, painting the Christmas decorations in garish colours. They checked my father's vital signs, looked at his pupils, asked questions about medications and alcohol consumption, and whether he'd lost consciousness. My mother hovered anxiously, wringing her hands, answering their questions in a voice that kept breaking. The paramedics strongly recommended transport to the hospital for observation given his age and the head injury and the amount of alcohol in his system. But my father refused. No hospital. He insisted, his words clearer now, his eyes more focused. Not until I talk to my daughter. I need to talk to Crystal first. Then I'll go. I promise I'll go, but I have to talk to her first. The paramedics exchanged glances, explained that he was legally allowed to refuse treatment, made him sign a waiver, gave stern warnings about symptoms to watch for, and finally left their ambulance pulling away into the snowy night. The moment they were gone, Bradley turned on my mother with a fury I'd never heard from him before. "This is your fault," he said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "You pushed her too far. You've always pushed her too far, and now look what's happened." My mother's face went red, then white. "My fault!" she shot back, her voice rising to a near shriek. "I'm not the one who got drunk and told her she was taking up space. I'm not the one who said the words that made her leave. You're the one who never stopped him, who sat there and watched him favour you your entire life and never said a word." They continued arguing, their voices overlapping accusations, flying back and forth, neither one willing to accept responsibility, both desperate to deflect blame onto someone else. Sarah tried to intervene, suggesting they all calm down, but they ignored her. My father sat on the couch where the paramedics had helped him, his head in his hands, saying "Crystal, Crystal," over and over like a prayer or a curse. And Grandma Helen, still sitting at the dining room table, quietly picked up her phone and sent me a text message. Just 4 words: "Come home right now." Then my mother grabbed her phone. Then Bradley grabbed his. Then even Sarah, caught up in the panic, started trying to reach me. And so they began calling Crystal. Desperately, frantically, 42 times. I was still sitting in that parking lot, the snow falling heavier now and beginning to blur the edges of the world around me, when my phone first lit up in the cup holder. I was a woman trying to hold onto the peace I'd just found, trying to protect the fragile boundary I'd finally drawn, and I knew instinctively that whatever was on that screen had the power to pull me back into the chaos I'd just escaped. My hand hovered over the phone for a moment, and I made a conscious decision to ignore it. They'd taken enough from me tonight. They didn't get to take this moment to this quiet space where I could finally breathe. The phone went dark, then lit up again, and again, and again. At first, I kept my eyes on the windshield, watching the snow accumulate, letting the ringtone fade into background noise. This was manipulation, I told myself. This was exactly what they always did when I tried to set boundaries, tried to claim any autonomy. They'd panic. They'd demand my attention. They'd find a way to make their feelings my responsibility. I'd seen this pattern my entire life. I wouldn't fall for it again. But after the 7th or 8th call, curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen, and opened my messages instead of answering the calls. The first text had come at 8:05, just minutes after I'd left. "Mother. Come back. Your father wants to talk." The message was brief, almost businesslike, and I felt a surge of anger reading it. Of course he wanted to talk now that I'd left, now that I'd made my exit. Suddenly, he wanted to talk. Where was that desire to talk when he'd called me wasted space in front of everyone? Where was it during the decades I'd spent trying to earn his attention? I deleted the message without responding. The calls continued. I watched the notifications pile up on my screen, each one making my stomach tighten a little more. 10 missed calls. 15. 20. At 8:15, a text from Bradley appeared. "Sis, Dad fell. You need to come back." Forced, I stared at those words, feeling my resolve waver for the first time. Dad fell. My mind immediately went to the worst possibilities, catastrophic injuries, emergency rooms, but then the rational part of my brain kicked in. This could be an exaggeration, a manipulation tactic, a way to force me back into the house by manufacturing a crisis. He'd been drunk. Maybe he'd stumbled. Maybe he'd made a show of falling to garner sympathy. I'd seen him do similar things before, though never quite this dramatically. But what if it was real? What if he was actually hurt? The thought made my chest tighten with an anxiety I resented feeling. They didn't deserve my concern. They'd spent 35 years proving they didn't care about my well-being, so why should I care about theirs? And yet I found myself scrolling through the accumulating messages, found myself unable to simply drive away as I'd planned. 8:30 brought another message from my mother, this time in all capital letters. "Crystal, your father is calling your name." The caps lock felt like shouting, like accusation, like she was blaming me for whatever was happening in that house. I could picture her perfectly phone in one hand, the other hand pressed dramatically to her chest, making everything about her reaction rather than the actual situation. But beneath my anger, I felt the old familiar guilt creeping in that voice that had been trained into me since childhood, whispering that I was being selfish, that family came first, that a good daughter would come back. The calls kept coming. 25, 30, 35. My phone was lighting up constantly, now a strobe effect in the darkening parking lot, and I found myself paralyzed by indecision. This is manipulation, I told myself. They're doing this because you finally stood up for yourself and they can't handle it. But another voice, quieter and more insistent, asked, "What if it's serious? What if he's really hurt? What if something happens to him and you never came back, never gave him a chance to apologize, never heard whatever it is he wants to say?" At 8:50, a text from Grandma Helen appeared, and this one made me catch my breath. "Sweetheart, please come home. Your grandfather needs you. Not them, you." Grandma Helen never manipulated me. She was the one person in that family who'd always been honest, always been kind, always seen me for who I actually was. If she was asking me to come back, maybe there really was something wrong. Maybe this wasn't just theatrics. I sat there with the phone in my hands, watching the snow fall and the messages accumulate, torn between the boundary I'd just set and the possibility that this time, this one time, the crisis might actually be real. The rational part of my brain said this was exactly how they keep me trapped forever, by creating emergencies every time I tried to leave. But the part of me that was still, despite everything, their daughter couldn't quite silence the worry. At 8:55, another text appeared, this time from my father's phone. "Your father says he's sorry and needs to tell you something important." But the typing was too clean, too grammatically correct. I knew immediately my mother had sent it, had taken his phone and typed the message herself. The manipulation of it made me angry all over again. Then at 8:58, one final message appeared on my screen. This one was different. The words were misspelled, the letters shaky, as if typed by unsteady hands. It came from my father's number, but this time I knew it was actually him. "I love you. I'm sorry. I need to tell you the truth." I was staring at that message in the blue glow of my phone screen, at those misspelled words that somehow carried more weight than any perfectly crafted apology could have, and I felt the last thread of my resistance snap. I was a woman who had finally chosen herself, who had walked away with dignity and peace, and now I was being pulled back, not by manipulation or guilt, but by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the daughter in me who still, despite everything, loved the man who had hurt her. Maybe it was simple human decency. Or maybe it was the need to look him in the eye one more time and make sure he understood that this time, when I left, it would be on my terms and my terms alone. Whatever it was, it got me to turn the key in the ignition, to back out of that parking lot, and to drive those 15 minutes back through the snow to the house I'd thought I'd left behind forever. When I pulled into the driveway at 9:15, the house looked exactly as it had an hour ago. All those warm lights still glowing behind the windows, the Christmas wreath still hanging on the door. But I was different. The woman who walked up those porch steps was not the same woman who had driven away. I was done apologising, done shrinking, done pretending that their dysfunction was somehow my responsibility to fix. I opened the door without knocking because this was still technically half my house, even if they didn't know it yet, and stepped into the foyer. They were all in the living room, and the moment they heard the door open, they rushed toward me in a chaotic cluster of voices and movement. My mother reached me first, her face blotchy from crying, her hands reaching for my arms. "Oh, thank God, Crystal, we were so worried your father fell and hit his head, and..." Atanai. Bradley was right behind her, talking over her. "Sis, I'm glad you came back. He's been asking for you non-stop." Sarah hovered uncertainly in the background, and I could see my father on the couch through the doorway, his head bandaged, his face pale. I held up one hand. Just one hand, palm out, and the gesture was so unexpected, so unlike anything I'd ever done before, that everyone stopped talking immediately. The silence that fell was complete, and in it I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear my own breathing steady and controlled. They stared at me confused by this version of their daughter and sister, who commanded space rather than apologising for taking it up. "I need you all to be quiet and listen," I said, and my voice was calm, almost eerily so. I wasn't angry, I wasn't crying, I was simply done with the chaos, done with everyone talking at me instead of listening to me. I walked past them into the living room, and they followed like uncertain children, none of them quite sure what to do with this new dynamic. My father was sitting on the couch, a white bandage taped to his temple, his skin grey and his eyes red-rimmed. When he saw me, something in his face crumpled, and I watched tears spill down his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head slightly and he closed it again. Our eyes met across the room, and in that moment I saw everything: his shame, his guilt, his desperate need for forgiveness. And in my eyes he must have seen something he'd never seen before, because his face went even paler. He saw that I had stopped expecting anything from him, stopped hoping, stopped waiting for him to be the father I needed. That kind of emptiness is more frightening than anger. "I came back because you fell," I said clearly, my words measured and deliberate. "Not because you called me 42 times. Not because you sent me a text saying you were sorry. I came back because I needed to see with my own eyes that you were okay, and then I needed to say something to all of you." I paused, letting that sink in, watching them shift uncomfortably. "I'll stay tonight. I'll sleep in the guest room, and in the morning I'm leaving, and I won't be back for a long time. Maybe never." The words landed like stones in still water, and I watched the ripples spread across their faces. My mother's mouth opened in protest, her hand flying to her chest in that dramatic gesture she'd perfected over decades. "Crystal, you can't mean that we're your family. You can't just..." "She has every right," my father said, his voice rough and broken, cutting through my mother's objection with an authority I rarely heard from him. "Patricia, stop. She has every right to walk away from us. We've given her every reason to." "Why are you?" My mother turned to stare at him, shock written across her features, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, and the devastation in his eyes was complete. I felt something in my chest that might have been sympathy, but I couldn't afford to let it soften me. Not yet. Not while I was still standing in this house, still breathing this air that had suffocated me for so long. "I'm going to the guest room now," I said, turning toward the stairs. "We can talk in the morning if you want to, but tonight I need to be alone." I took 3 steps toward the staircase, and I felt the collective exhale of relief from my family. They thought the crisis was over. They thought I'd come back, and that meant everything would return to normal. That by morning, we'd all pretend this hadn't happened, that we'd go back to our assigned roles and continue the performance we'd been staging for 35 years. I could feel them relaxing, could sense their assumption that they'd weathered the storm. That's when Grandma Helen stepped out of the kitchen doorway, where she'd been standing silently this entire time, watching everything unfold, with those sharp eyes that miss nothing. She moved into the living room with her cane, her small frame somehow commanding the space in a way that made everyone turn toward her. "No," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Before anyone goes to sleep, before anyone retreats to their corners, there are things that need to be said, things that should have been said years ago." I stopped on the stairs, my hand on the railing, and turned to look at her. She met my eyes, and I saw determination in her weathered face, saw love and protectiveness, and a kind of fierce resolution. She looked at my father, then at my mother, then back at me. "Crystal saved this house 5 years ago," Grandma Helen said into the silence. "She paid off the mortgage when the bank was about to foreclose. She became a legal owner of this property, and not one of you has ever thanked her. Not one of you has even acknowledged what she did." And what Grandma Helen said next would change everything they thought they knew. I was standing frozen on the 3rd step of the staircase, my hand gripping the railing so hard my fingers had gone numb, and the air in the room had suddenly become thick with a tension so palpable I could taste it. I was a woman who had just watched her grandmother take the first step into territory I hadn't been ready to enter, who realised that the secret I'd been carrying for 5 years was about to become public knowledge, whether I was prepared for that or not. The peace I'd felt in the car, the boundary I'd drawn, the decision I'd made to leave in the morning, all of it suddenly felt inadequate because I understood that this night was far from over. My family was staring at Grandma Helen with confused expressions, not yet grasping what she'd just revealed, and I saw my father's face go from pale to nearly translucent as he understood that the truth he'd kept buried was about to surface. But before anyone could respond, before the questions could start flying and the chaos could erupt, Grandma Helen looked directly at me and said quietly, "Crystal, come with me to the kitchen. Now." It wasn't a request. I descended the stairs and followed her, feeling everyone's eyes on my back, hearing my mother start to say something behind me, but my father's sharp "let them go" cutting her off. The kitchen was blessedly quiet after the tension of the living room, and Grandma Helen moved to the table with careful, deliberate steps. She pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my arms crossed over my chest, feeling defensive and exposed, and not entirely sure what was about to happen. She looked at me with those wise, tired eyes that had seen 85 years of human behaviour and could read people like large print books. "I've known the truth for 5 years," she said without preamble, her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the living room, but firm enough to brook no argument. "Your father told me what you did, asked me to keep the secret, said it was his shame to bear, and he didn't want the family to know how close he'd come to losing everything. I kept that secret because he's my son, and he asked me to. But enough is enough, Crystal. Enough." I felt my throat tighten, felt the careful composure I'd been maintaining threaten to crack. "Grandma, I don't want to do this tonight. I don't want to throw it in their faces. I just want to leave in the morning and be done with all of this." My voice came out smaller than I intended, and I hated the pleading note I heard in it. She reached across the table and took my hand in hers, her skin papery and cool, but her grip surprisingly strong. "Child, if you leave without them knowing the truth, nothing will change. They'll spend the rest of their lives thinking you're the one who was unreasonable, who walked away from a loving family over one drunken comment. They need to understand what they've taken for granted. They need to see what you've sacrificed." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "And you need to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own blindness." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that it didn't matter anymore, that I'd made my peace with leaving and didn't need their acknowledgement or their guilt. But even as I formed the words in my mind, I knew they were a lie. Some part of me did need them to know. Some part of me needed them to understand that their invisible daughter had been holding up the roof over their heads for 5 years, while they praised her brother for setting the table. Grandma Helen released my hand and reached into the pocket of her cardigan, pulling out a folded piece of paper that looked official, legal important. In 2018, she began unfolding the document carefully. The bank was 60 days away from foreclosing on this house. Your father had been struggling for years, had refinanced twice, had borrowed against the equity until there was nothing left to borrow. He owed $180,000, and he didn't have it. He couldn't declare bankruptcy because of his pride, couldn't ask the extended family for help, because he couldn't bear the shame of admitting he'd failed where his father and grandfather had succeeded. I remembered that summer vividly, remembered the phone call where my father's voice had been so small, so broken. I'd never heard him sound like that before or since. He'd explained the situation with the halting words of a man confessing his deepest failure, and I'd listened with my heart breaking because despite everything, despite all the ways he'd overlooked me and favoured Bradley, he was still my father, and I couldn't bear to hear him sound so defeated. I told him I could help, I said quietly, the memory washing over me. I had savings. I'd been saving since I got my first real job, living below my means, investing carefully. I had enough to pay off the mortgage with some left over, but I told him I needed something in exchange. You asked to be added to the deed. Grandma Helen finished smoothing out the paper on the table between us. 50-50 ownership, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. A completely reasonable request, a smart financial decision, and one that gave you legal protection for the enormous amount of money you were about to hand over. I nodded, staring at the document that I recognised, even though I'd only seen it once before, on the day we'd signed it at the lawyer's office. Dad agreed. We met with a real estate attorney, transferred the funds, updated the deed. It was all legal and above board. And then he came home and told Mum and Bradley that an old college friend had loaned them money at a low interest rate. The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'd thought I'd made peace with that lie, but apparently I hadn't. He lied because he was ashamed, Grandma Helen said gently. Not of you, but of himself. He couldn't bear to tell his wife that his daughter had bailed him out. Couldn't stand to let Bradley know that his big sister had saved the family home. So he invented a fiction, and that fiction became the truth everyone believed. I looked down at the deed, at the words printed in official legal language, at the two names listed as owners, David Michael Becker and Crystal Marie Becker. Equal partners in a house where I'd never been treated as an equal in any way that mattered. For 5 years, I've watched them live in this house, complain about the property taxes, talk about renovations they want to make, and not once has anyone acknowledged that half of it belongs to me. Not once. You didn't just save their house child, Grandma Helen said, her voice hard now, angry in a way I rarely heard from her. You saved your father's pride. You saved him from having to admit failure to his family, from having to face the judgment of his siblings and cousins, from having to sell the home his grandfather built. You gave him that gift, and they thanked you by treating you like you were invisible. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I loved them, because I couldn't stand the thought of them losing this place. I know that, Grandma Helen said softly. That's what makes their treatment of you so much worse. You loved them enough to give them everything, and they couldn't even be bothered to notice. She picked up the deed and placed it firmly in my hands, folding my fingers around the paper. But now, sweetheart, the whole family needs to know the truth, and you're going to tell them. I was holding that deed in my hands, like it was made of lead rather than paper, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle into my bones, and I understood that this moment would divide my family's history into before and after. I was a woman, standing at the edge of a cliff, about to push us all over. And even though Grandma Helen was right, even though they needed to know, some part of me was terrified of what would happen when the truth finally landed. The kitchen felt too small, suddenly too warm, and I could hear the murmur of anxious voices from the living room. where my family waited, not yet knowing that their entire understanding of the last 5 years was about to be shattered. I looked at Grandma Helen one more time, seeking some kind of reassurance or permission to back out, but her expression was resolute and loving and utterly uncompromising. We walked back into the living room together, Grandma Helen's cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor, and I saw my father's face go through several emotions, in quick succession relief that we were returning dread at what was coming, and finally resignation. He knew. He'd known from the moment Grandma Helen had mentioned the mortgage that this secret's time had come. He pushed himself up from the couch with visible effort, his hand going briefly to the bandage on his temple, and moved toward his study without a word. My mother started to ask where he was going, but he held up a hand to silence her, and she fell back into her chair with a confused, almost frightened expression. He returned less than a minute later, carrying a small, fireproof safe that I recognized from his study closet. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it as he set it on the coffee table with a heavy thunk. The sound seemed obscenely loud in the silence. He fumbled with the combination, his fingers missing numbers, having to start over twice before the lock finally clicked open. From inside, he withdrew a manila folder, and from that folder he pulled out a document that was the twin of the one I held in my hands. "Everyone, sit down," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Patricia, Bradley, Sarah, sit now." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a finality that made them all obey without question. They sat watching him with wide eyes, and I remained standing near Grandma Helen. My copy of the deed still clutched in my hands, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My father placed the original deed on the coffee table, smoothing it out with trembling fingers. "5 years ago, I nearly lost this house," he began, and his voice broke on the word lost. The bank was going to foreclose. I was 60 days from losing the home my grandfather built, from destroying the legacy I was supposed to protect. I was too ashamed to tell any of you, too proud to ask for help from the extended family, too scared to face the reality of my failure. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "David, what are you talking about? You said your friend James loaned us money. You said everything was fine." "I lied," my father said flatly. "There was no loan from James. There was only Crystal." He gestured toward me, and every eye in the room turned to look at me. I felt pinned by their stares, exposed and vulnerable in a way that made my skin crawl. Crystal paid off the entire mortgage, $180,000. Money she'd saved from years of careful work and sacrifice. She saved this house. She saved us. Bradley leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face confused. "But why wouldn't you tell us? Why would you lie about something like that?" "Because your sister asked for something in return," my father continued, tapping the document on the table. "She asked to be added to the deed, to become a legal co-owner of this property. 50-50. It was a completely reasonable request, and I agreed." My mother picked up the deed with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the document. I watched her read it once, then again, then a third time, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Her face drained of colour, until she looked almost as pale as my father. "David Becker and Crystal Becker joint tenancy with right of survivorship." She read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at my father, and I could see the moment understanding crashed into her. "So you're saying Crystal could kick us out? This is legally half hers." My father nodded, his jaw tight. "Legally, yes. She owns 50% of this house. She could force a sale and take her share. She could charge us rent to live here. She could demand we buy her out. She has every legal right to do any of those things." He paused, looking at me with something that might have been fear. "She could have done any of that at any point in the last 5 years, but she didn't. She just let us live here, let us treat this as our home, and never said a word." Bradley's reaction was the one that broke my heart. Not anger, not defensiveness, but pure devastation. His face crumpled as the full weight of what he was hearing sank in. "You did this 5 years ago?" he asked, looking at me with eyes that suddenly saw me, really saw me, maybe for the first time in years. "You saved our home 5 years ago and never told us. You saved everything and we—" He stopped, shook his head, tried again. "We treated you like you didn't matter, like you were nothing. And the whole time you literally owned half the house we were living in." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear my own breathing ragged and uneven. I looked at their faces, at the shock and shame and dawning comprehension, and felt something break loose inside my chest. For 5 years I'd carried this secret, had watched them take for granted the home I'd saved, had endured their casual dismissals and thoughtless cruelty while knowing I had the power to displace them all. And I'd never used it, never even threatened to use it, because despite everything, I'd loved them. "I didn't do it for power," I said, and my voice came out thick with tears because I could no longer hold back. "I didn't do it to have leverage over you or to hold it over your heads. I did it because I loved you, because you're my family, and I couldn't stand to see you lose this place." The tears were falling now hot tracks down my cheeks that I didn't bother to wipe away. But now I realised something. In 5 years, not one of you ever asked me how I was doing financially. Not one of you wondered if maybe I'd made sacrifices to save this house. You never even noticed I was gone. My voice broke on that last word, and I finally let myself cry, let myself feel the full weight of 5 years of invisibility, of loving people who couldn't be bothered to love me back. Then I began to cry. I was standing in the middle of the living room with tears streaming down my face, finally letting myself feel 35 years of accumulated hurt, and I could see the shock in their faces as they watched me break. I was a woman who had always held it together, who had swallowed every slight with a smile, who had never made them uncomfortable with my pain, and now I was falling apart in front of them, and they had no script for this version of me. The silence that followed my confession was thick and suffocating, broken only by my ragged breathing and the quiet sound of my crying. I felt raw, exposed, like I'd peeled back my skin to show them the wounds they'd inflicted, and I didn't know if I regretted it or felt relieved. My mother was the first to try to speak, rising from her chair with her hands reaching toward me in a gesture that looked like concern but felt like performance. "Crystal, honey, we didn't know," she said, her voice taking on that plaintive tone she used when she wanted to be seen as the victim. "We didn't know you'd done that for us. If we'd known, we would have been so grateful. We would have treated you differently." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something cold settle into my chest where warmth used to live. "You didn't know because you never asked," I said, and my voice was steadier now, harder. "About my life, about my struggles, about my successes. For 32 years you didn't ask. You didn't notice when I got promoted. You didn't care when I bought my condo. You didn't wonder how I could afford to take time off work to come home for holidays. You didn't ask because you weren't interested in the answer. I was just the reliable one, the one who showed up and cooked and cleaned and never complained, and that was enough for you." The words cut through the room like a knife, and I watched my mother's face crumple, watched her sink back into her chair as if I'd physically pushed her. Bradley was staring at the floor, his hands clasped so tightly between his knees that his knuckles had gone white. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into the couch cushions, and my father was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between anguish and determination. Then he stood up abruptly, the movement so sudden that everyone jumped. He swayed slightly, his hand going to his head as if the quick movement had made him dizzy, but he steadied himself against the arm of the couch. "But you still don't know everything. he said, and his voice had taken on a strange quality, urgent and almost desperate. He turned to look at my mother, and there was something in his gaze that made her face go from pale to ashen. There's a reason. There's a reason your mother treats you this way. And it's time she told you. My mother shot to her feet, her hand outstretched toward him in a stopping gesture. David, no, she said, and her voice was pure panic, now high and strained. Please, not now, not like this. This isn't the time. We can talk about this later, privately, when everyone's calmer. If you don't tell her, I will, my father said, cutting through her protests with a finality that made it clear he wasn't backing down this time. Crystal deserves to know why she paid the price for your guilt. She deserves to understand why you've pushed her away her entire life while clinging to Bradley like he was your salvation. I felt my stomach drop, felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice small again, all the strength I'd gathered suddenly deserting me. I looked between my parents, seeing my mother's face twisted in fear, and my father's set in grim resolve. And I knew that whatever was coming next was going to hurt in ways I wasn't prepared for. My mother was shaking her head frantically, tears starting to stream down her face. Please, David, please don't do this to me. Not in front of everyone. I'm begging you. But my father wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, and in his eyes I saw apology and pain and the weight of a secret that had been crushing him for longer than I'd been alive. Crystal, he said softly, and I heard genuine love in his voice for maybe the first time that I could remember. What I'm about to tell you will hurt, but you need to know the truth about the day you were born. I was standing in the middle of the living room, feeling like the floor had turned to quicksand beneath my feet, and I had no idea what my father was about to say, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would change everything I thought I understood about my life. I was a woman who had just revealed one devastating truth and was now bracing for another, and I could feel the fragile composure I'd rebuilt after my tears beginning to fracture again. My mother was crying openly now, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside her. Bradley looked between our parents with growing horror, clearly understanding that whatever was about to be revealed was bigger than the mortgage, bigger than the house, bigger than anything we'd discussed so far. My father took a deep breath and began speaking in a voice that sounded like it was costing him everything to keep steady. When you were 3 months old, Crystal, in the spring of 1988, your mother suffered from severe postpartum depression, the kind that makes women believe terrible things about themselves, that makes them incapable of connecting with their babies, that turns every moment into a battle just to survive. He paused, glancing at my mother, who was still hiding behind her hands. One morning in May, I woke up and she was gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't do this. I'm sorry." That was all. Just those 6 words. I felt my knees weaken and reached for the back of the nearest chair to steady myself. "What do you mean she was gone?" I whispered, though some part of me already understood exactly what he meant. "She left," my father said, and the pain in his voice was evident. "She packed a bag in the middle of the night and walked out. Left you in your crib, left me, left everything. I filed a missing persons report, called everyone we knew, searched everywhere I could think of. And for 8 months we heard nothing. I raised you, with your grandmother's help, this house full of baby bottles and diapers, and a little girl who kept growing while her mother was God knows where." I looked at my mother, who had lowered her hands and was staring at the floor, tears still streaming silently down her face. "You left me," I asked, my voice breaking on the words. "You left me when I was 3 months old," my father continued before she could answer. 8 months later, the police found her in California. She was living under an assumed name, working at a diner, and she was 5 months pregnant. He paused, letting that information sink in, and I felt the room tilt sideways as I understood what he was saying. The baby's father was someone she'd met during those months, someone I never met and whose name I never knew. When they brought her home, when I saw her standing on our porch holding her growing belly, I had a choice to make. "You took her back," I said numbly, looking at Bradley with new understanding flooding through me. "And you raised Bradley as your own." "I loved your mother," my father said simply, "and I knew she'd been sick, that the depression had taken her to a place where she couldn't think clearly. So yes, I took her back. We agreed never to tell anyone what had happened. We said she'd been visiting her sick aunt in California for those months, and when Bradley was born, I put my name on the birth certificate, and I loved him as my son because that's what he was. That's what he is." Bradley made a sound like he'd been punched, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a gasp. "I'm not. Dad isn't." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the identity crisis that was suddenly exploding inside him. My father turned to him quickly. "You are my son, Bradley. In every way that matters, you are my son. I chose you. I chose to be your father. Blood doesn't make family. Love makes family." He looked back at me. But the cost of that choice was paid by Crystal. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice raw and broken. "I looked at you, Crystal," she whispered, still not meeting my eyes. "When I came back and saw you 9 months old, crawling and babbling and reaching for me like I hadn't abandoned you, all I felt was emptiness. And then terror that I would hurt you again, that I wasn't capable of being your mother, that I was a monster who had left her baby." She was sobbing now, the words coming out in gasps. "When Bradley was born, when I held him, I felt guilt that nearly destroyed me. Guilt for leaving you. Guilt for what I'd done to your father. So I loved Bradley harder, desperately trying to prove I wasn't a monster, trying to prove I could be a good mother. And I pushed you away because every time I looked at you, I saw the baby I abandoned. I saw my greatest shame reflected in your face." The words hung in the air like poison, and I felt something inside me that had been holding on finally let go completely. Every dismissal, every comparison to Bradley, every time she'd look through me instead of at me, suddenly made a horrible, devastating kind of sense. I stood slowly, my legs somehow supporting me, even though I felt like I was made of paper, and I looked at my mother with years of pain crystallizing into one question. So my entire life, every moment I wasn't good enough was because you couldn't forgive yourself. I was standing in that living room, looking at my mother with a clarity that felt like glass shattering, and the question hung between us unanswered because what answer could possibly make this right? I was a woman who had just learned that her entire childhood, her entire sense of worthlessness had been built on the foundation of her mother's guilt and self-hatred, and I didn't know whether to scream or collapse, or simply walk out the door and never look back. The silence that followed my question was absolute, broken only by my mother's quiet sobbing and the sound of Bradley leaving the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he fled to process the revelation that his father wasn't his father and his entire identity was built on a lie. We stayed like that, frozen in our various states of shock and grief, until Grandma Helen quietly suggested we all needed food and rest before continuing this conversation. No one had the energy to argue. Lunch was a silent, nightmarish affair. We sat around the same dining table where I'd been told I was taking up space just last night, and we ate leftovers that no one tasted. My mother didn't look up from her plate once. My father tried several times to start a conversation and gave up when no one responded. Bradley didn't come down from his room. Sarah, who had witnessed far more family trauma than any girlfriend should have to endure, excused herself to take a walk. And I sat at my usual spot at the end of the table, mechanically eating food I didn't want, feeling hollowed out and strange, like I was watching this scene from outside my own body. By 2:00, we'd given up the pretense of eating and returned to the living room. The winter afternoon light was streaming through the windows, making everything look deceptively peaceful, and I found myself thinking how wrong it was that the world could look so normal when everything inside this house had been torn apart. I sat down on the chair farthest from everyone else, and I knew that if I didn't say what I needed to say now, if I didn't make them understand the full extent of the damage their choices had caused, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I need to tell you something, I began, and my voice was surprisingly steady. I need you to understand what it's been like. Not just the theory of it, not just, oh, we treated you differently. I need you to know the specific moments when you broke me. My father nodded, his face haggard. We're listening. I was 17 years old, I said, looking at my mother, though she still wouldn't meet my eyes. It was the summer before my senior year. Bradley had just turned 14. He took your car, Mum, while you were at your book club. He was drunk. He'd been drinking with his friends at Tommy Peterson's house. He crashed into a mailbox on Maple Street, did $1,500 worth of damage to the front end. I watched my mother's face, saw the memory register. When you came home and saw the car, you asked what happened. And Bradley told you I'd let him take the keys. I wasn't even home. I was at my job at the library. But you believed him. You used my college fund to fix the car, and you grounded me for being irresponsible. Crystal, My mother started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. When I was 22, I earned a full scholarship to a master's program at BU. Full ride, stipend included. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. I called you from my apartment so excited I was shaking. You answered the phone and I told you the news. You said, "That's nice, dear," in that distracted voice you always use with me. Then you said Bradley was calling on the other line about his new girlfriend, and you'd call me back. You never called me back. My mother's hand went to her mouth, her eyes finally meeting mine, wide with dawning horror. At 28, I got promoted to senior analyst. I'd been working toward that position for 3 years. I came home for the weekend to celebrate, to share my success with my family. We sat at dinner and I tried to tell you about it. You listened for maybe 30 seconds before you interrupted to ask when I was going to settle down and give you grandchildren. You spent the entire meal talking about how my biological clock was ticking, how career success was meaningless without a family. And when I left that weekend, you told me I looked tired and should take better care of myself. The room was completely silent now. Even my father looked stricken, as if he was hearing these stories for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe he'd been so focused on enabling my mother's dysfunction that he'd never actually paid attention to how it manifested. Oh, sure, I didn't need you to love me more than Bradley, I said, and my voice finally broke, tears starting again, despite my best efforts to hold them back. I never asked for that. I never wanted him to feel less loved. I just needed you to see me at all. Do you know what it's like to achieve something great and have your own mother look through you like you're glass? Like you're not even there, like your accomplishments are just background noise in the story of your brother's life. I was fully crying now, ugly sobs that shook my whole body, and I didn't care anymore about dignity or composure or any of it. I wasn't sad that you didn't love me. I was sad that you made me believe I wasn't worth loving at all. Then Bradley suddenly stood from where he'd been sitting silently in the corner since returning from his room, and he stumbled toward the door with his hand pressed to his mouth like he was going to be sick. I watched him wrench open the front door and disappear into the snow-covered yard. Without thinking, I followed him outside into the cold. I was stepping out into the December afternoon without my coat, the cold hitting my tear-stained face like a slap, and I saw Bradley sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that he was trying and failing to suppress. I was a woman who had just spent the last hour recounting the ways my family had broken me, and yet seeing my brother fall apart triggered something in me that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a deep, aching empathy. He was the golden child, yes, the favoured one, the one who got all the love and attention and praise I desperately wanted. But watching him crumble under the weight of truths he'd never asked to learn, I realised that he'd been used just as surely as I'd been dismissed. We were both casualties of our mother's inability to forgive herself, just in different ways. I sat down beside him on the cold wooden steps, feeling the chill of the snow-dusted boards seep through my clothes, and I said nothing. I just sat there close enough that our shoulders were almost touching, and I waited. A full minute passed in silence, broken only by his ragged breathing and the distant sound of wind moving through bare tree branches. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was blanketed in white, peaceful and pristine, in stark contrast to the chaos we'd left inside the house. Finally, Bradley lifted his head and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes that held a devastation I'd never seen in him before. "I always knew you were better than me," he said, his voice rough from crying. "Smarter, kinder, stronger, more capable in every way that actually matters. But Mum kept telling me I was special, that I had to make something of myself, that I couldn't let..." He stopped, swallowed hard. She'd say, "Don't let yourself fall behind Bradley. You have to work twice as hard. You have to prove yourself." And I never understood why she was so desperate for me to succeed. Why every small achievement had to be celebrated like I'd cured cancer. Why she was always pushing, always worried, always hovering. I felt something twist in my chest. Even in her favoritism, she'd been suffocating him. "She was using you," I said quietly, "using your success to prove to herself that she was a good mother." "I'm not the golden child," Bradley said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I'm her redemption project. Every time I got a decent grade or a promotion, or did anything even remotely praiseworthy, she'd light up like I'd saved her life. And now I understand why. Because every accomplishment of mine was proof that she hadn't completely destroyed her capacity to be a mother. That despite abandoning you, despite leaving her 3-month-old baby, she could still raise a successful son." He laughed, a bitter sound with no humour in it. "Everything I achieved was just her trying to prove she wasn't a monster. And I never questioned it because I liked being the favourite. I liked being the centre of attention. I liked being praised for mediocrity while you were ignored for excellence. You were a child," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. "You didn't create this dynamic. She did. But I benefited from it." Bradley shot back, anger and self-loathing mixing in his voice. "I'm 32 years old, Crystal. At some point I should have noticed. I should have seen how she treated you. I should have defended you, stood up for you, done something." He turned to look at me fully now, and I saw guilt etched into every line of his face. "At Christmas dinner last night, when Dad said that thing about you taking up space, I just stared at my plate. I didn't say a word, and when you walked out, when you left, and everything started falling apart, my first thought wasn't, we need to apologise to her. It was, how dare she ruin Christmas?" The honesty of that confession should have hurt, but instead I felt a strange kind of relief. At least now we were dealing in truth instead of comfortable fiction. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I'm so sorry, Crystal," he said, and fresh tears were streaming down his face. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I was complicit in your erasure. I'm sorry I took all the love and attention and never thought to question why you weren't getting any." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I'm sorry that it took finding out I'm not even Dad's biological son to make me understand how fucked up all of this has been." I felt my own tears starting again, but they were different now, softer somehow. "You're not the villain in my story, Bradley," I said, reaching over to take his hand. His fingers were ice cold and I squeezed them gently. "You're the other victim. We both lost our childhoods to her guilt. She couldn't love me because I reminded her of her failure, and she couldn't let you breathe because you were her proof of redemption. Neither of us got an actual mother. We just got different versions of her dysfunction." Bradley made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "That's a really depressing way to put it." "But it's true, isn't it?" I said. "We're both casualties of the same war. It's just that your wounds looked like privilege while mine looked like neglect." He turned toward me then and pulled me into a hug so fierce it almost knocked us both off the steps. We clung to each other in the cold, two siblings who had been pitted against each other by circumstances neither of us had chosen, and we cried together for the first time in 20 years. Maybe for the first time ever. I felt his chest heaving with sobs, felt his arms tight around me like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go, and I realised this was the brother I could have had all along if our mother's trauma hadn't built walls between us. When we finally pulled apart, both of us shivering from the cold and exhausted from emotion, Bradley wiped his eyes and asked, "What happens now? Are you really leaving tomorrow and never coming back?" I looked at him then, at the house behind us, where our family waited, and I felt the weight of the decision settling onto my shoulders. I owned half this house. I had legal power. I could force a sale, could demand payment, could use the deed as leverage to exact consequences for 35 years of pain. Or I could simply walk away and let them figure out their own healing without me. But now came the hardest part. I had to decide what I would do with the power I held. I was sitting on those cold porch steps with my brother's arm still around my shoulders, and I realised that the power I held wasn't really about the house or the deed or the legal leverage I could wield if I chose to. I was a woman who had spent 35 years giving these people control over my sense of worth, and the real power was in taking that control back, in deciding for myself what I deserved and what I would accept. The house was just paper and wood and legal documents. The real question was whether I would continue to accept crumbs of affection from people who should have been offering me a feast, or whether I would finally believe that I was worth more than what they'd been willing to give. Bradley and I sat there for another moment in silence, and then I stood up, brushed the snow from my clothes and said quietly, "Come on, we need to go back inside." By 5 o'clock, we were all gathered in the living room again, and the winter sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood in the centre of the room, not sitting this time, not taking a peripheral position, but claiming the space in a way I never had before. My family watched me with expressions ranging from fear to hope to exhaustion, and I felt surprisingly calm, surprisingly clear about what needed to happen next. "I need to tell you what I've decided," I began, and my voice was steady, authoritative, in a way that made everyone sit up straighter. "I'm not going to force a sale of the house. I'm not going to demand rent or payment or use the deed as a weapon. That was never why I helped you. But things are going to change, and you need to understand what my boundaries are going forward." My father nodded slowly, his face still pale, but his eyes focused and attentive. "We're listening." "First, financial boundaries," I said. "I will not provide financial support in secret anymore. If you need help, you ask me directly, and we discuss it as equals, not as your invisible safety net who swoops in to save you and then gets treated like a boise she doesn't exist. If I choose to help, it will be a conscious decision with clear terms, not a secret you're ashamed to acknowledge." My mother opened her mouth to say something, but I held up my hand and she fell silent. Second, respect boundaries. I will not attend family gatherings where I feel invisible or disrespected. That means if you want me at Christmas or Thanksgiving or any other holiday, you show me that you value my presence. You include me in conversations. You ask about my life. You treat me like I matter. If you can't do that, I won't come, and I won't feel guilty about it. Bradley was nodding, his face serious and focused. Sarah sat beside him holding his hand, and I saw approval in her eyes. Third, communication boundaries. I will maintain contact on my terms at my pace. No more guilt trips about not calling enough or not visiting enough. No more obligations based on, but we are family. Only genuine relationship built on mutual respect and actual interest in each other's lives. If you want a relationship with me, you earn it. You don't get it just because we share DNA. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything that had been said, and I watched my mother's face crumple as the reality of what I was telling her sank in. She began to cry again, deep sobs that shook her whole body. "So I've lost you?" she asked through her tears, her voice breaking. "Is that what you're saying? That I've lost my daughter?" I looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me, and then spent my entire life running from me, and I felt something that was equal parts compassion and finality. "No, Mum," I said gently. "You never had me. You can't lose something you never actually held. But now, if you do the work, if you actually try to change, you have the chance to earn me, to build something real instead of this broken, toxic dynamic we've been living in." I turned to address all of them, my voice growing stronger. "I forgive you. I forgive all of you for the ways you've hurt me, for the years of invisibility, for making me believe I wasn't worth loving. I forgive you because carrying that anger was destroying me. But forgiveness doesn't mean returning to how things were. It doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen or that we can just move on without change. Forgiveness means I'm free. Free to build something new if you're willing to do the work. Free to walk away if you're not. And you're free too. Free from the guilt and the secrets and the dysfunction. Free to become better versions of yourselves. But that's your choice to make." My father was crying silently, tears streaming down his face. Bradley had his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. Even Grandma Helen, who had sat quietly through all of this, had tears in her eyes. "I'm staying tonight," I announced. "Tomorrow morning I'm going home, and we'll see what happens next." I was lying awake in the guest room bed at 6 o'clock on the morning of December the 26th, watching the winter dawn paint pale grey light across the ceiling, and I hadn't really slept at all. I was a woman who had spent the previous day tearing apart her family's foundation and then trying to rebuild something new from the rubble, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying every conversation, every revelation, every tear-stained confession. The exhaustion was bone deep, but my thoughts kept racing, wondering if I'd said too much or not enough, if my boundaries were too harsh or still too lenient, if anything would actually change, or if this had all been just another performance that would fade once I left. I was planning to pack my things and drive back to Boston in a few hours, and I was trying to convince myself that I'd done everything I could, that whatever happened next was no longer my responsibility. Then, I heard the soft knock on my door so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. I sat up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders against the morning chill, and called out softly, "Come in?" The door opened, and my father stood there in the dim hallway light, still in his pajamas and robe, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The bandage on his temple was clean and fresh, suggesting he'd been awake long enough to change it, and he was holding something in his hands that looked like folded paper. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, and I wondered if he'd slept any more than I had. "I'm sorry to bother you so early," he said, his voice rough, "but I needed to talk to you before you left, before I lost my nerve." I nodded and gestured to the chair beside the bed. He sat down heavily, and for a moment we just looked at each other in the growing light. Two people who had spent 35 years not really seeing each other, trying to figure out how to start. Finally, he held out the paper he'd been carrying, and I saw it was a letter written in his familiar handwriting, the pages worn as if they'd been handled many times. The date at the top read September 15th, 23, 3 months ago. "I started writing this in September," he said as I unfolded the pages with trembling hands. "I kept meaning to send it, kept rewriting it, kept telling myself I'd find the right words, if I just tried hard enough." He paused, swallowing hard. "Dear Crystal, I know I've failed you. I've known it for years, if I'm being honest with myself. I've watched your mother treat you like you were invisible, and I did nothing. I've watched her praise Bradley for breathing while dismissing your accomplishments, and I stayed silent. I chose peace in my marriage over protection of my daughter, and I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that cowardice." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I looked up at him, and saw his own tears falling freely. "Why didn't you send it?" I whispered. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I knew no words would be enough to fix what I'd broken. Because I kept hoping I'd find the perfect way to say it, and meanwhile months passed and I still hadn't sent it, and Christmas was coming, and I thought, maybe if I could just get through the holidays without incident, I could give it to you then. I could sit you down and finally have the conversation I should have had decades ago." His voice broke. "And then I drank too much and said the cruelest thing instead. I called you wasted space when you're the person who saved us all." I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, so I just reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine with desperate tightness, like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "I'm going to therapy," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I already made an appointment for next week. Couples therapy with your mother and separate therapy for myself. I need to learn how to set boundaries with her, how to stop enabling her dysfunction, how to be a better man than I've been." He looked directly into my eyes. "And I'm going to call you every week, not just when there's a crisis, not just on holidays. Every week I'm going to call and ask how you are and actually listen to the answer. I'm going to learn about your life, your work, your hopes, all the things I should have been asking about for 35 years. Dad," I started, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. Please." He took a shaky breath. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve another chance. But if you're willing to give me one, I swear to you I will do the work. I will become the father you deserved to have all along. I know I can't change the past, but maybe if you'll let me, I can help build a better future." The silence that followed was thick with years of hurt and hope tangled together. Then my father said the words I had waited 32 years to hear, and they came out in a voice so raw with emotion it was barely above a whisper. "You don't take up space, Crystal. You create something beautiful wherever you go. I just wish I'd seen it sooner." I was sitting on the edge of that guest bed, holding my father's hand and listening to words I desperately needed to hear my entire life, and I felt something inside me that had been frozen for decades begin to thaw. I was a woman who had built walls around her heart to protect herself from the people who should have loved her unconditionally, and those words were the first real crack in those walls, the first genuine reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, something could actually change. The tears were flowing freely now, both mine and his, and we sat there in the pale morning light crying together in a way we never had before, not with shame or manipulation, but with honest grief for all the years we'd wasted. When I could finally speak, I squeezed his hand and said what I needed him to understand. "I don't need you to be perfect, Dad. I never needed that. I just need you to try. Really try. Not for my sake, not to make yourself feel better, not to ease your guilt, for yours. Because you deserve to be a better person than you've been, and so does everyone in this family." He nodded, wiping his eyes with his free hand. "I want to be specific about what I'm committing to," he said, his voice steadier now. "I don't want to make vague promises that sound good but don't mean anything. I want you to know exactly what I'm going to do." I appreciated that more than he could know. Vague promises had been the currency of this family for too long. "Okay," I said. "Tell me." "First couples therapy with your mother. I already called Les a therapist yesterday after you went to bed. We have our first appointment next Thursday at 2:00. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, she specialises in trauma and family systems." He pulled out his phone and showed me the calendar appointment, as if he needed to prove it was real. Second individual therapy for myself. Same therapist has an opening for me on Tuesdays. I need to work on my enabling behaviours on why I found it easier to keep the peace than to protect you, on how to be a partner to your mother without being complicit in her dysfunction. I felt something loosen in my chest at the specificity of it. These weren't just words, these were actual concrete steps. "What else?" I asked quietly. "Family therapy when everyone's ready. Not next week, not next month, but when we've each done enough individual work that we can come together and actually communicate instead of just hurting each other. He paused, meeting my eyes. And weekly phone calls with you, every Sunday at 7 p.m. if that works for your schedule. Just to talk. No agenda, no crisis, no obligation. I want to know about your life, what you're working on, what you're reading, how you're feeling, all the ordinary details I should have been asking about for 35 years. The commitment in his voice made my throat tight. Sunday evenings work, I managed to say. I know I've given you no reason to trust these promises, he continued. I know that words are easy and follow-through is hard, so I'm not asking you to believe me right now. I'm just asking you to give me the chance to prove it over time. I looked at him, at the sincerity and determination in his exhausted face, and I made a decision to be completely honest rather than comforting. These aren't promises to me, Dad, I said gently but firmly. These are promises to yourself. You have to do this work because you want to be a better person, not because you want to fix things with me. If your motivation is about earning my forgiveness or making me come back, you'll give up the moment it gets hard or the moment I don't respond the way you want. But if you're doing it for you because you're tired of being the man who enabled abuse and chose comfort over courage, then maybe it'll stick. He absorbed that for a long moment, his face reflecting the difficulty of what I'd just said. Then he nodded slowly. You're right. You're absolutely right. I need to do this whether you ever forgive me or not, whether you ever come back for Christmas or not, because I'm tired of being this person. I'm tired of looking in the mirror and seeing a coward. I'll believe it when I see it. I said not with anger, but with the simple honesty of someone who had learned not to accept promises at face value, not to punish you just to protect myself. I've learned that people's actions matter more than their intentions. That's fair, he said. More than fair. We sat there for another moment in silence, and then he asked in a voice that was almost shy, Can I hug you? A real hug, not the obligatory kind we do at holidays? I hesitated, feeling the old instinct to protect myself warring with this new tentative hope, and then I nodded. He stood and pulled me to my feet, and we embraced in the middle of that guest room as the sun began to break through the morning clouds outside. It was the first real hug we'd had in years, maybe ever, the kind where both people are actually present and vulnerable rather than just going through the motions. I felt his chest heaving with sobs, felt his arms tight around me, and I let myself cry into his shoulder for the father I'd never had and the one he was promising to become. We stood there for what felt like a long time, two broken people trying to figure out how to heal, and I felt something shift in my heart. Not forgiveness yet, not trust, but maybe the possibility of both some day. A knock on the door made us both jump and pull apart. We turned to see Bradley standing in the doorway, his hair dishevelled and his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, looking like he hadn't slept all night. I was still standing in the middle of the guest room with tear-stained cheeks and my father's hand on my shoulder, and I watched Bradley hover uncertainly in the doorway, like he wasn't sure if he had permission to enter. I was a woman who had just begun to believe that maybe my father could change, and now here was my brother, the golden child whose entire identity had been built on lies and favoritism, looking more vulnerable and lost than I'd ever seen him. My father squeezed my shoulder gently and said quietly, I'll give you two some time, then slipped past Bradley with a supportive pat on his back as he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and suddenly it was just Bradley and me. In the pale morning light, two siblings who had lived parallel lives in the same house, but had never really known each other. Bradley stayed near the door for a moment, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his sweatpants, before he finally moved to sit in the chair my father had just vacated. He looked at me, with eyes that held a kind of devastation I recognised because I'd seen it in my own mirror too many times to count. I didn't sleep last night, he said, his voice rough. I just laid there thinking about everything. About Dad not being my biological father. About Mum abandoning you. about every single moment of the last 32 years and how completely twisted all of it was. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, pulling the blanket around my shoulders again. That's a lot to process in one night, so I thought. I realised something, he continued, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I've been living a life Mum designed for me. Every choice, every ambition, every measure of success has been filtered through what she needed me to be. And I don't even know who I am without her expectations. Who is Bradley when he's not performing for his mother's approval? I have no fucking idea. The vulnerability in his admission made my heart ache. That must be terrifying, I said softly. It is, he admitted, because if I strip away all the roles she needed me to play, the golden child, the successful son, the proof that she wasn't a monster, what's left? I'm 32 years old and I feel like I'm starting from zero. He looked up at me, and I saw fear and determination mixed together in his expression. But I need to do it. I need to figure out who I actually am. How are you going to do that? I asked, genuinely curious. I'm starting therapy next week. Already made an appointment yesterday with someone Sarah recommended. And I'm going to take some space from Mum and Dad, actually live on my own, instead of being 15 minutes away and having Sunday dinners every week where Mum can keep her hooks in me. He took a deep breath. I'm going to stay with my friend Marcus for a while, give myself some physical distance to figure things out without constant interference. I felt a surge of respect for him. Running away was easy. Staying and doing the hard work of self-discovery was much more difficult. That's really brave, I said, meaning it. Bradley looked at me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. I want to rebuild our relationship, Crystal, from scratch, not as golden child and scapegoat, not as the favourite and the forgotten, but as equals, as actual brother and sister who give a damn about each other's lives. He paused, seeming to gather courage. Can we start over? Not pretend the past didn't happen, because that would be dishonest. And we've had enough lies in this family. But can we build something new? Something real? I considered his question carefully, not wanting to give him false hope, but also not wanting to close a door that might lead somewhere good. We can try, I finally said. But you have to mean it, Bradley. You can't do this for a few months until it gets hard and then fall back into old patterns. You can't call me when you need something, but forget I exist the rest of the time. If we're going to do this, it has to be real. I know, he said quickly. I want it to be real. I want to know my sister. The actual Crystal, not the version of you I invented in my head to justify ignoring you. He pulled out his phone. What if we do monthly video calls first Sunday of every month? Just you and me, no parents, no pressure, no agenda. We just talk about our lives, our struggles, whatever. Build something genuine over time. The specificity of the plan, much like my father's commitments, made it feel more believable. First Sunday of every month, I repeated. I can do that. Bradley stood up and moved toward me, and before I could decide if I was ready for it, he pulled me into a tight hug. I'm sorry I didn't defend you, he whispered against my shoulder. I'm sorry I was complicit in your erasure. I'm sorry I took all the love and left you with scraps. I'm going to do better. I swear to you, I'm going to do better. I hugged him back, feeling tears starting again, and I thought about how strange it was that it took our family completely falling apart for us to finally find each other. I believe you want to, I said honestly, and that's enough for now. We pulled apart and Bradley wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Are you still leaving this morning? Yes, I said firmly. I need to go home. I need space to process all of this, and you all need time to do your work without me hovering around as a constant reminder of what went wrong. He nodded, understanding in his expression. Will you come back for Easter or something? Maybe, I said. We'll see how the next few months go. if people actually follow through on their promises, if things actually change. That's fair, Bradley said, echoing our father's words from earlier. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me one more time. Thank you for not giving up on us completely. You had every right to walk away and never look back. I still might, I said honestly, but I'm willing to see what happens if you all actually do the work. He nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him, and I was alone again in the guest room with the morning sun now streaming fully through the windows. I looked at the clock and saw it was nearly 8. I needed to pack, needed to get ready to leave, needed to return to my real life in Boston, where I was competent and valued and visible. But there was still one person I needed to face, the hardest one of all. I was standing alone in the guest room with my packed bag at my feet, and I knew I couldn't leave without having one final conversation with the person who had shaped my entire sense of worthlessness. I was a woman who had confronted my father and my brother and found pathways toward potential healing, but my mother was different, more complicated, more damaged, and I wasn't sure if she was even capable of the kind of honest self-reflection that change would require. The anger I'd felt toward her had burned itself out over the past 2 days, leaving behind something colder and sadder pity mixed with a desperate need to know if she could see what she'd done, if she could own it without hiding behind excuses or mental illness or the million justifications people use to avoid accountability. I found her in the living room at 10 o'clock, sitting alone on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, looking small and defeated in a way that would have made me feel guilty a week ago, but now just made me feel tired. She looked up when I entered, and I saw fear flash across her face, before she quickly tried to mask it with something that might have been composure. "Crystal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know if you'd want to talk to me before you left." "I almost didn't," I admitted, sitting down in the chair across from her, maintaining physical distance, because I needed that boundary. But I realised I needed to say some things, and I needed to hear some things from you, or I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. She nodded, wringing her hands in a gesture of anxiety I'd seen countless times. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, and her voice broke on the last word. "I don't know how to undo 32 years of damage. I don't know how to make you believe I'm sorry." "You can't fix it," I said bluntly, and I watched her flinch at the words. "You can't undo the damage. What's done is done. But you can stop making it worse. You can start building something new if you're willing to do the actual work, and it starts with admitting the full truth, not just to me, but to yourself. No more hiding behind postpartum depression or guilt or any other explanation that lets you off the hook." Patricia looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, and I saw something that might have been defiance flicker and die. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say what you did," I responded, leaning forward. "Not the sanitized version, not I struggled with mental health. The actual truth. Can you say it? Can you say I abandoned my daughter and then I punished her for it?" The silence that followed was so long I thought she might refuse, might retreat into her usual pattern of deflection and victimhood. But then her face crumpled, and she began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. "I abandoned my daughter," she whispered through her tears, each word seeming to cost her something essential. "I left my 3-month-old baby, and I ran away, and I didn't come back for 8 months. And when I did come back, when I saw what I'd done, I couldn't forgive myself. So I punished her. I pushed her away, and I favoured her brother, and I made her invisible because looking at her made me see my own failure. I abandoned my daughter, and then I punished her for it." Hearing her actually say it, hearing her voice the truth without excuse or qualification, broke something open in my chest that I hadn't known was still sealed. I felt tears on my own cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. "That's the truth," I said softly. "That's what you did to me." "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I'm so sorry, Crystal. I know sorry isn't enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know, I'm sorry." I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what I needed to say next. I forgive you for leaving. I do. You were sick. You were in crisis. You did something desperate when you were drowning. I understand that wasn't really you making that choice, but I don't forgive you for making me pay for your leaving for 32 years. I don't forgive you for choosing your guilt over your daughter. I don't forgive you for loving Bradley to prove you weren't a monster while treating me like I was the monster for existing and reminding you of your shame. Patricia's sobs intensified and she looked like she might shatter into pieces. I don't blame you. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve anything from you. That's not for me to decide what you deserve. I said, my voice firm but not cruel. What I can tell you is this. If you do the work, real work, actual therapy, an actual change, an actual effort to become a different person than you've been, then maybe someday we can have something. Not what we should have had. Not a normal mother-daughter relationship. But maybe something new, something honest, something built on who we actually are instead of who we wish we were. Maybe. She looked up at me with desperate hope in her eyes. You'd give me that chance after everything? I'm giving everyone in this family that chance, I said, not because you've earned it, but because I refuse to let your dysfunction define the rest of my life. But Patricia, you need to understand that the chance isn't a guarantee. If you do what you've always done, if you fall back into old patterns, if you use your guilt as an excuse instead of a catalyst for change, then I'm gone, and I won't come back. She nodded frantically. I'll do the work. I swear I'll do the work. Your father already made therapy appointments. I'll go. I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes. Don't do it for me, I said, echoing in what I told my father. Do it for you. Do it because you're tired of being the woman who abandoned her baby and spent 30 years punishing her for it. Do it because you deserve to be better than that. Before Patricia could respond, the living room door opened and Grandma Helen stepped in, leaning on her cane, her expression serious and determined. She looked at Patricia with something that might have been pity or might have been judgment. Patricia, she said in that quiet voice that somehow carried complete authority, there's something you should know. I've told the family. I was sitting in the living room watching my mother's face drain of what little colour she had left, and I felt a sudden spike of alarm mixed with curiosity about what Grandma Helen had done. I was a woman who had just finished the hardest conversation of her life and was feeling emotionally wrung out, and now my 85-year-old grandmother was standing in the doorway with an expression that suggested she'd taken matters into her own hands in a way that was about to have consequences none of us had anticipated. My mother's hands gripped the armrest of the couch so tightly, her knuckles went white, and I could see panic rising in her eyes as she processed what Grandma Helen had just said. What do you mean? You told the family? My mother asked, her voice rising with each word. Which family? What did you tell them? Grandma Helen moved into the room with slow, deliberate steps, her cane tapping against the hardwood floor, with the rhythm of inevitability. She settled herself into the wing-back chair, with the careful movements of someone whose bones ached but whose will was iron. I called your sister Mary yesterday evening while you were all having your various breakdowns and revelations. I told her everything. About you leaving when Crystal was a baby, about the real reason Bradley exists, about the way you've treated Crystal for 32 years, about the mortgage Crystal paid off that you never acknowledged. My mother stood up abruptly, swaying slightly like she might faint. Helen, how could you? That was private. That was family business. You had no right. I had every right, Grandma Helen interrupted, her voice quiet but cutting like a blade. I'm family too, Patricia, and I've watched you destroy my granddaughter for 3 decades while you hid behind secrets and shame. Some things can't stay buried. The truth always finds its way out, and your family needed to know why they never saw Crystal at family gatherings, why she stopped coming to reunions and weddings and holidays on your side. I sat frozen, unsure how I felt about this development. Part of me was horrified at the idea of the entire extended family knowing our private dysfunction. But another part, a deeper part, felt a strange sense of relief. The secret had been suffocating all of us, and maybe exposure was exactly what we needed. Mary was horrified, as you might imagine. Grandma Helen continued looking at my mother with something that might have been disappointment or pity. She said a lot of things I won't repeat, but the essence was that she finally understood why Crystal disappeared from family events. She thought Crystal had become too good for the family, too successful to bother with her relatives. Now she knows the truth. They all know the truth. My mother sank back onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. Everyone knows. Oh God, everyone knows what I did. Yes, Grandma Helen said simply. They do. And they'll judge you for it, Patricia. Your sisters, your cousins, your aunts and uncles. They'll all sit with this information and form their opinions, and you'll have to live with that. That's the consequence of your choices. Not legal consequences, not financial consequences, but social ones. The people who've known you your whole life now know what kind of mother you've been. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. Grandma, I'm not sure this was your decision to make. She turned to look at me with those wise, tired eyes. Perhaps not child, but someone needed to advocate for you, and you've spent your whole life being too kind, too understanding, too willing to protect the people who hurt you. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or revenge. It comes from the truth being told and people having to sit with what they've done. Your mother needs to face the full weight of her actions, and that includes the judgment of the people whose opinions she cares about. I absorbed that understanding the logic, even if I wasn't sure I agreed with the method. Grandma Helen reached into the bag she'd been carrying and pulled out Grandma Helen's tablecloth, the one I'd brought just 2 days ago, the one that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. She held it out to me with steady hands. I embroidered this for you, sweetheart, she said, and her voice was gentle now, loving. Not for your mother. I made it 6 months ago specifically for you, and I told you to give it to her because I wanted to see if she'd recognise that it was meant for you. I stitched your initials into the corner, used your favourite colours in the thread-incorporated symbols that meant something to our conversations. And she didn't notice any of it. She dismissed it as peculiar, criticised the colour, and never once looked closely enough to see that it was a love letter to her daughter. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I took the tablecloth, running my fingers over the intricate stitching, seeing now what I'd missed before. The evergreen branches weren't random. They formed the shape of the tree we'd planted together. When I was 7, the one in her backyard that was our tree. The gold thread formed tiny stars in the pattern of the constellation Cassiopeia, which she taught me to find when I was young. And there in the corner, so small, I'd need a magnifying glass to see it clearly were my initials woven into the design. You made this for me, I whispered, holding the fabric like it was precious treasure. I made it for you because I wanted you to have something beautiful that was undeniably yours, something no one could dismiss or overlook or repurpose. I wanted you to know that at least one person in this family saw you, really saw you, and loved what she saw. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, Crystal. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it comes in the form of truth that can't be denied anymore. I stood up carefully, folding the tablecloth and holding it close to my chest. My mother was still sitting on the couch with her face in her hands, and I felt something toward her that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite compassion, but was maybe just acceptance that she would have to live with the consequences of her choices. Grandma Helen struggled to her feet, and I moved to help her, but she waved me off with characteristic independence. Go on, child, she said softly. Go home. Start your new life. We'll all still be here when you're ready to come back, if you ever are. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender perfume, feeling her papery cheek against mine. Thank you, I whispered, for everything, for seeing me when no one else did. That's what grandmothers are for, she said, patting my back gently. Then she pulled away and looked at me with those sharp eyes that mistook nothing. Now go, before someone tries to make you stay for lunch. I picked up my bag from where I'd left it by the door, tucked the tablecloth carefully on top of my belongings, and walked out into the late morning sunshine. The air was crisp and cold, but the sky was brilliantly clear, the kind of winter day that makes everything look sharp-edged and new. I walked to my car, placed my bag in the trunk with deliberate care, and then turned to take one last look at the house where I'd grown up. The house I now legally co-owned, the house that held so much pain, and also maybe the beginning of something better. This time, I looked at it with peace. I was standing beside my car with the winter sun warming my face, and the weight of 35 years somehow lighter on my shoulders, and I realised that peace wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of clarity. I was a woman who had walked into her family's house 2 days ago, carrying hope and hurt in equal measure, and I was leaving with something different. Not closure exactly, because that suggested an ending, but maybe an opening, a possibility that things could be different if everyone actually did the work they'd promised. I got into my car, started the engine, and as I pulled out of the driveway one final time, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes forward on the road ahead, on the life waiting for me in Boston, that I'd built with my own hands and that no one could take away from me. The drive back was nothing like the drive there had been. The highway stretched ahead of me with clear skies and light traffic, and instead of dread pooling in my stomach, I felt something I could only describe as liberation. The snow from the previous days had been ploughed into neat banks on either side of the road, and the world looked clean and bright and full of possibility. About 40 minutes into the drive, as I merged onto I-93 and the city skyline began to appear on the horizon, the sun broke through the scattered clouds in a way that felt almost theatrical, sending shafts of golden light across the winter landscape. And I laughed. Actually, laughed a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest, surprising me with its genuineness. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that, without bitterness or performance. Just pure, unexpected joy at being alive and free, and finally done with trying to earn love from people who didn't know how to give it. I needed to share this with someone who would understand, someone who had been witness to my struggles over the years, and who deserved to know how it had ended. I pressed the button on my steering wheel to dial Emma's number, my best friend of 12 years, who had held me through countless tearful phone calls after family visits, and who had never once told me to just get over it, or that family was family. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Crystal, everything okay?" "Everything's actually okay," I said, and even I could hear the wonder in my voice. "I'm driving back to Boston, and Emma, I have so much to tell you." "I have time," she said immediately. "Tell me everything." So I did. I talked for the next 45 minutes, as the miles disappeared beneath my wheels, telling her about the wasted space comment and walking out about the 42 calls and my father's collapse about the deed and the mortgage and owning half the house. I told her about my mother abandoning me as a baby, about Bradley not being my father's biological son, about all the revelations that had torn my family apart, and maybe, just maybe, given us the chance to build something better. Emma listened without interruption, letting me pour it all out, and when I finally finished and fell silent, I heard her take a deep breath. "Crystal," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion, "I'm so proud of you. You walked through fire and came out whole. Do you understand how rare that is? How hard that is?" I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were different tears now, warm instead of burning. "I don't feel whole. I feel like I've been taken apart and put back together wrong." "Not wrong," Emma corrected gently. "Different, better, stronger. You know what's beautiful about everything you just told me? You didn't burn the house down. You literally had the power to destroy them, to take their home, to use that deed as a weapon, and you didn't. You didn't use your power to hurt them. You just claimed your space. Finally, after 35 years of making yourself smaller and smaller, you finally said, "No, I belong here too, and you will acknowledge me or I will leave." That's not revenge, Crystal. That's dignity. Her words settled into my chest like a warm drink on a cold day. I hadn't thought of it that way, because you're still too close to it. But trust me, what you did was incredibly brave. You set boundaries without cruelty. You told the truth without weaponizing it. You demanded better while leaving room for them to actually become better. That's the kind of strength most people never find. I merged into the left lane, Boston's skyline growing larger ahead of me, and I tested out the phrase my father had said, the one that had cracked something open inside me. "I take up space beautifully," I said softly, almost to myself. "What was that?" Emma asked. "Something my dad said this morning. He said I don't just take up space, I create something beautiful wherever I go. And I'm trying to see if I can believe it." "You should believe it," Emma said firmly, "because it's true. You've always made every space you enter better, kinder, more thoughtful. The only people who couldn't see it were the ones who were determined not to look. But Crystal honey, you have to start seeing it yourself. You have to start believing that you're not the problem. You never were." I repeated it again, louder this time, testing the words like I was trying them on for the first time. "I take up space beautifully." "Again," Emma encouraged. "I take up space beautifully." And this time, saying it, I felt something shift. Not completely, not a total transformation, but a small crack in the wall of unworthiness I'd built around myself. A tiny opening where light could get in. Slowly, gradually, I was starting to believe it might actually be true. We talked for a few more minutes about logistics, about when I'd come over to tell her everything in person about the dinner she was going to cook me, because you need comfort food and wine after a weekend like that. When we finally hung up, I drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, letting the peace I'd found settle more deeply into my bones. 30 minutes from Boston, my phone lit up with a text message. I was driving through the outskirts of Boston, with the city rising up around me in all its familiar, beautiful chaos, when I glanced down at my phone screen in the holder on my dashboard and saw my father's name. I was a woman who had spent the last 4 hours processing the most emotionally exhausting weekend of her life, and part of me didn't want to read whatever he'd sent, didn't want to let him back into the peace I'd just found. But a stronger part of me, the part that had chosen to leave a door open rather than slam it shut, needed to know what he had to say. At the next red light, I picked up my phone with slightly trembling hands and read the message that appeared on the screen. "I love you. First therapy appointment scheduled for Tuesday at 2 p.m. with Dr. Rebecca Morrison. Individual session on Thursday at 10 a.m. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just want you to know I'm doing the work. I want to become the father you deserve to have all along. No pressure to respond, no expectation, just wanted you to know. Dad." I sat there at the red light, staring at those words, reading them, once, then twice, then a third time, and I felt something complicated and tender move through my chest. Not trust, not yet, because trust had to be earned over time through consistent action, but maybe the seed of it. Maybe the first fragile shoot of hope that he actually meant what he'd said. He'd followed through on his first commitment, already had made the appointments he said he would make, had done it without demanding my acknowledgement or approval. That mattered. That was different. The light turned green, and I tucked my phone back into its holder without responding. I would save it to a folder called Important, and I would keep every message like it that followed. Not as proof to show anyone else, but as a record for myself, a way to track whether words translated into actions over weeks and months. And I would respond eventually, when I was ready, on my timeline, not his. That was the boundary, and I was going to honour it. The familiar landmarks of Boston began appearing around me as I navigated through the afternoon traffic. The brownstones, I loved the narrow streets, that felt like home, the blend of old and new architecture that made this city feel like it honoured its history while constantly evolving. I'd moved here 7 years ago, and I'd fallen in love with the independence this city had given me the way my life here was entirely of my own making. No one in Boston knew me as the invisible daughter. They knew me as Crystal senior analyst, competent, professional good friend. And that version of me felt more real than the version my family had created. I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage. At 1 o'clock, gathered my bags from the trunk and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. When I unlocked the door to apartment 4C and stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't expected, the overwhelming sense of coming home. Not just to a physical space, but to myself, to the life I'd built brick by brick when no one was watching. My apartment was modest, just 700 square feet of hardwood floors and big windows overlooking a slice of the city. But it was mine. Every single thing in this space I had chosen with intention. The deep blue couch I'd saved for months to buy. The bookshelf filled with volumes I'd collected over years. The photographs on the walls showing my actual life, me at the Grand Canyon with Emma, me receiving an award at work, me laughing with friends at a dinner party in this very apartment. The whole space was a testament to a woman who had built a life worth living despite being told she was taking up space she didn't deserve. I set my bags down and stood there for a moment, just breathing, just letting myself feel the safety of these walls. Then I moved toward my luggage and carefully extracted Grandma Helen's tablecloth. I unfolded it with reverent hands because that's what it was, proof that someone had seen me, really seen me, and had taken the time to create something beautiful, specifically for me. I carried it to my small dining table and spread the tablecloth across its surface with meticulous care. The evergreen embroidery caught the afternoon light streaming through my windows, and the gold thread seemed to glow. I traced my fingers over the familiar shapes I now understood were meant for me, the constellation of Cassiopeia that my grandmother had taught me to find the tree we'd planted together when I was small. And there, in the corner, my initials CMB, Crystal Marie Becker. Not just embroidered, but woven into the design so intricately that they were part of the pattern itself, impossible to remove without destroying the whole thing. I stepped back and looked at my table, transformed by this gift, and I thought with absolute clarity, this is home. This has always been home. Not the house in New Hampshire where I'd spent my childhood feeling like a ghost. Here. This 700 square feet of space I'd claimed for myself. I made myself a cup of coffee, the good kind I saved for special occasions, ground fresh in the French press I'd bought myself as a birthday present. I added cream and sugar because that's how I liked it. That's how Crystal liked it. And Crystal's preferences mattered now in a way they never had before. I carried my coffee to the window, my favourite spot in the whole apartment. The December sun was already beginning its early winter descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and as I stood there watching the city move below me, I saw the first few snowflakes begin to fall. They danced past my window in lazy spirals, and I watched them with something approaching wonder. Snow had fallen all weekend in New Hampshire, but I'd been too wrapped up in drama and pain to really notice it. Now safe in my own space, I could appreciate its beauty. I thought about everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. My father's promise to go to therapy. My mother's breakdown and confession. Bradley's commitment to figure out who he was. Grandma Helen's quiet justice in telling the extended family the truth. The deed that gave me legal power I'd never asked for. All of it swirled in my mind like those snowflakes outside my window, individual moments that would eventually settle into a pattern I could understand. But standing there in my own space, holding my coffee, watching the snow fall on a city I'd built a life in all by myself, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. I felt proud. Proud of myself for walking out when I needed to, for refusing to accept that wasted space comment as the final word on my value. Proud for coming back when my father fell, for choosing compassion over revenge. Proud for setting boundaries that protected me without destroying them. proud for finally choosing myself after 35 years of choosing them. A small smile played at the corners of my mouth, genuine and unforced, and I let it stay there. I did deserve this moment of quiet happiness. That was the whole point. I had always deserved it, and the fact that my family couldn't see that said everything about them and nothing about me. My phone rang and I saw Emma's name lighting up the screen. I answered without hesitation, my voice warm and steady and sure. "Hey," I said, settling into my favourite chair by the window. "Want to come over? I think I have a story to tell you. And, really tell you with all the details I couldn't say over the phone. Plus, I want to show you something my grandmother made me." Emma's delighted "yes" came through the line, and as we made plans for her to come over in an hour with wine and Chinese takeout, I looked around my apartment one more time with new eyes. The photos on my walls showing my achievements, my travels, my chosen family, the bookshelf full of books I'd collected, the couch I'd refused to settle for, the plants I kept alive on the windowsill, green and thriving, the art I'd chosen because it moved me. The whole space was a testament to a woman who had built a life worth living. The snow was falling heavier now, coating the city in white, and I watched it transform the familiar landscape into something new and clean. That felt appropriate, like the universe was offering me a visual metaphor. Take what existed and cover it in something fresh, something beautiful. I had spent 35 years trying to earn love by being smaller, quieter, more invisible. I had twisted myself into shapes that hurt because I thought that was the price of belonging. I had given my family everything, including money that saved their house, because I kept hoping that if I just gave enough, they would finally see me. And it had taken my father calling me wasted space at a Christmas dinner. It had taken walking out and driving away. It had taken 42 missed calls and revelations that tore apart everything I thought I knew for me to finally understand the truth. I had never been the problem. I had never been too much or not enough or any of the things they'd made me believe I was. I had always been exactly who I was supposed to be: smart, capable, generous, strong, worthy of love and respect. They just hadn't been willing to see it. They were too lost in their own dysfunction, too trapped in patterns created by my mother's guilt and my father's enabling and decades of secrets. But I saw it now, standing in my apartment with snow falling outside my window, and my grandmother's love spread across my table, and my best friend on her way over. I finally saw myself clearly, not through the distorted lens of their neglect, but as I actually was, a woman who had survived a childhood of emotional neglect and built herself into someone remarkable anyway. Someone strong and capable and worthy, and yes, someone who took up space beautifully in this world. The realization settled into my bones, with a weight that felt like truth. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need my mother to acknowledge what I'd done, or my father to defend me, or Bradley to finally see me as an equal. Those things would be nice if they happened, but they weren't necessary for me to know my own worth. I knew it now. I believed it now. And that belief was mine to keep regardless of what they did in the months and years ahead. Sometimes the journey to finding yourself begins the moment you realize you don't need anyone to prove your worth. You only need to believe it yourself. And me, for the first time in my life, finally did. Conclusion. And that's where Crystal's story ends, or maybe where it really begins. She drove away from that house not as the invisible daughter who had spent 35 years begging for crumbs of affection, but as a woman who finally understood her own worth. She learned the hardest lesson any of us ever have to learn, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most are too broken to do it well, and that their brokenness is not our responsibility to fix. Crystal spent decades making herself smaller, hoping that if she just tried hard enough, achieved enough, gave enough, her family would finally see her. But the truth is, they were never really looking. And that wasn't about her value. It was about their inability to see past their own pain and dysfunction. What makes Crystal's story so powerful is what she chose to do with her power once she had it. She owned half the house. She could have destroyed them financially, could have forced a sale, could have used the deed as a weapon to exact revenge for 35 years of neglect and cruelty. But she didn't. She chose dignity over destruction. She set boundaries without burning bridges. She demanded better without demanding blood. That's real strength, not the kind that comes from striking back, but the kind that comes from knowing you deserve more and being willing to walk away if you don't get it. She gave them the gift of truth, painful as it was, and then she gave them the space to decide what they would do with it, whether her father follows through on therapy, whether her mother does the work to heal, whether Bradley becomes the brother he promised to be. None of that is Crystal's responsibility anymore. She's done carrying the weight of their dysfunction. She's done being invisible in her own life. If you've ever felt like Crystal, if you've ever been the forgotten child, the invisible sibling, the person who gives and gives until there's nothing left and still gets treated like you're not enough, I want you to hear this. You are not taking up space. You are creating something beautiful just by being who you are. The people who can't see it are looking through lenses distorted by their own wounds, and that has nothing to do with your worth. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be valued. You deserve to take up space without apologizing for it. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people who hurt you is to set a boundary and walk away until they're ready to do better. Crystal's story shows us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the hurt didn't happen or that everything is fine now. She forgave her family, but she also drew clear lines about what she would and wouldn't accept going forward. She didn't burn down their lives out of revenge, but she also didn't sacrifice her own well-being to protect their feelings. That's the balance so many of us struggle to find. We think we have to choose between complete estrangement or total self-sacrifice, but Crystal showed us there's a third option: conditional reconnection. I'll be here if you do the work. I'll give you a chance if you show me real change, but I won't wait forever, and I won't make myself smaller to make you comfortable. Think about the courage it took for Crystal to walk out of that Christmas dinner, to stand up from the table after being told she was wasted space and simply leave without making a scene, without yelling, without trying to make them understand. She just chose herself in that moment. And then think about the courage it took to go back when her father fell, knowing she was walking back into the same dynamics, the same pain, but going anyway, because compassion doesn't require self-destruction. She could be kind without being a doormat. She could care without being consumed. And what about Grandma Helen? The quiet hero of this story, the one person who had been watching all along, who had seen Crystal clearly and loved what she saw. She created that tablecloth over months of careful work, embedding Crystal's history into every stitch, and she watched to see if anyone in the family would notice it was made specifically for Crystal. When they didn't, when Crystal's mother dismissed it as peculiar, without ever really looking at it, Grandma Helen knew it was time to act. She told the extended family the truth, not out of cruelty but out of love for her granddaughter, who had been invisible for far too long. Sometimes love looks like exposing secrets. Sometimes justice whispers instead of roars. I think about Crystal standing in her Boston apartment at the end of her journey, spreading that tablecloth across her own table, understanding finally that she had always been worthy of something made with love specifically for her. She didn't need to earn it by being perfect or invisible or endlessly giving. It was hers because she existed, because she mattered, because someone saw her and thought she deserved something beautiful. That's what we all need, isn't it? To be seen clearly by someone who loves what they see. And if our families can't do that, if they're too damaged or dysfunctional or wrapped up in their own pain, then we need to find it elsewhere. In friends like Emma, who show up with wine and Chinese food and unconditional support. in grandmothers who embroider our constellations into linen, in the lives we build for ourselves in cities where no one knows our history and we can simply be who we are. If Crystal's story resonated with you, if you've lived some version of this pain, I want to hear about it in the comments below. What would you have done in her situation? Have you ever had to set boundaries with family? Have you ever been the invisible one in your own family story? Have you ever walked away from people you love because staying was killing you? Share your thoughts, your experiences, your own journey toward choosing yourself. And if you found strength or comfort or recognition in Crystal's story, if it helped you see something in your own life more clearly, I want to ask you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we share stories about real people facing real struggles, about the quiet courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone expects you to keep sacrificing. We talk about the messy, complicated reality of family dysfunction, about healing that doesn't look like Hallmark movies, about the strength it takes to walk away from people you love when staying is destroying you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, with the friend who's always making excuses for her family's treatment, with the sister who keeps going back, hoping this time will be different, with the colleague who flinches when you ask about her holiday plans because family gatherings feel like walking through a minefield, with anyone who's ever felt invisible in the one place they should have been most seen. Let's build a community of people who understand that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival, that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's kind, that sometimes love means letting go until the other person is ready to hold you properly. Leave a comment telling me what part of Crystal's story hit you hardest. Was it the wasted space comment at dinner? Was it the revelation about her mother abandoning her as a baby? Was it the moment she realised she owned half the house and could destroy them but chose not to? Was it Grandma Helen's tablecloth and the quiet way she showed Crystal she'd been seen all along? Or was it that final moment in Crystal's apartment when she finally believed she took up space beautifully? Tell me your story. Tell me how you found your way to believing in your own worth. Tell me about the people who saw you when your family didn't. Tell me about the moment you decided you'd had enough and walked away. This community is built on shared experiences and mutual support, and your story matters just as much as Crystal's does. And remember, wherever you are in your own journey, whether you're still sitting at that dinner table trying to make yourself smaller, or whether you're standing in your own apartment, finally understanding your worth, you are not alone. There are thousands of us who understand what it's like to be invisible in our own families, who know what it feels like to achieve incredible things and have no one notice, who've spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And we're all here telling you the same thing. Crystal finally learned you don't take up space, you create something beautiful wherever you go. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Subscribe, comment, share, and I'll see you in the next story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that you deserve better, because you absolutely do.